I've recently made recordings about why leftists are so keen to endorse identity politics because it's ethically compatible with their politics. It's convenient to think about society in that kind of top down, centralized kind of way because then it facilitates centralized control over an economy, over a planned economy, for instance. Um, I'm now going to sort of slightly invert that concept and just going to frame it in like why leftists are vulnerable or prone to identity politics. And I'm going to sort of also frame this as why it's generally tragic, why it has negative consequences, and why um, also why then the hypothesis of the Italian Marxists who turned fascists, or I think it's Giovanni, I can't remember his surname. Anyway, there was at least one famous Italian Marxist who basically didn't give up his Marxism, but then basically worked out a kind of a Marxist fascist hypothesis that when you had maturing capitalism, it would precipitate into effectively some kind of ethno state because the society or the community would naturally devolve into depending on and relying on a kind of racial identity, probably. Um, anyway, that's a slight tangent to all of this, but it's you'll see why it's relevant. So it was pointed out to me that the internal rationale for identity politics, also by someone who doesn't see what the problem. I mean, I was discussing it with someone who doesn't see the problem with identity politics essentially, and they said, it comes from a pure intentioned sort of mindset that it can only be good to sort of to lean into collective guilt because if you feel guilty about something, then you want to do something positive about it, or something like that. And it got me thinking that, that essentially the problem with identity politics is that it completely convolutes and it messes up and it muddles up the concept of discrimination. It broadens the concept of discrimination. You think, oh, well, you can only do better in the world if you broaden the definition of discrimination, if you sort of expand that concept so that then people will be morally impelled to do more or something like that. There'll be more positive action somehow in the system once you've got this ethical machine running. And it is interesting because I think identity politics did essentially appear out of nowhere. I mean, ontologically, I think we can recognize that it comes directly from intersectional feminism. Um, and so, it's sort of it was first the kind of the feminist mode of relating and conceptualizing society in terms of sex and gender or whatever, and then it became broadened and generalized um, to the idea that the system itself can discriminate, not individuals within a system, but just the system can be represented by power factions, and therefore you can impute a weird kind of moral agency on people that's based on a kind of generalization. Now, okay, that's the sketch. Let me substantiate it in a delineated fashion. So you can understand that the concept of collective guilt, you might as well call it collective responsibility, or you might as well call it collective blame. And as soon as you embrace, let's say, an ethical proposition like collective blame, uh, you can just see that almost the original notion of racism was that you would blame people collectively for a cherry picked, sort of thumb sucked, prejudiced or bigoted, sort of conjecture or something like that, or supposition, or theory that then you just generalize to a whole group. So you can really see how essentially the basic essence of racism is inculcated into this new definition of discrimination, this new definition uh, of or this new interpretation of reality that gets generated by this ethical filter or moral filter, which generalizes people in a very racialistic sort of way, or, in a, very prejudiced and bigoted sort of way. Um, And I'm going to make some broader claims now. I think the reason why leftists are vulnerable to this is because their thinking relies on this kind of conceptual generalization over society, because you can't have a solution or in line with the left wing, with at least the radical left wing sort of way of dealing with problems, unless you can transform what might be individual obstacles in life into pervasive conditions which are shared, into a kind of a general external locus of control that needs to be destroyed or opposed because it's unjust, because it's morally deficient. So there is this tendency within the leftist worldview to try to generalize problems and to make them into systemic conditions, to interpret them as systemic conditions rather than individual obstacles. And perhaps you could also say, uh, to try to make people irresponsible for how they participate in culture, and instead to kind of turn the view of culture into a narrative of systemic oppression. Because then one's responsibility as an individual for participating in life and navigating life gets transformed into a claim for justice against the system or something like that. That something has to be done about it on a collective scale, not on an individual scale. And I think, this can be true in some circumstances, especially when the law itself is has prejudice built into it, not in its outcome or its effect or its interpretation, but in its actual direct framing, its actual direct conceptual, so it's interesting that affirmative action under my categorization of these things would be um, an infringement of the law being would infringe the normative value that the law should not directly discriminate. Um, anyway, or at least affirmative action in the way of quotas and things like that. I think that there are other ways of having positive, progressive, interventionist policy, but that doesn't try to engineer outcomes and that essentially selects its beneficiaries in a justifiably broad way, that you would essentially select beneficiaries based on objective criteria which didn't have anything to do with race. That just had to do with means testing, for instance, socioeconomic means testing or other tests, because, it should usually, when you want to have a successful policy that is trying to do good, you're going to try to exploit some kind of opportunity that hasn't been developed. You're going to try to, trying to find you're going to sort of try to bridge a gap, some kind of developmental gap, or some kind, you're trying to fill in a kind of a bridge between potential and accessing opportunity, that you're going to sort of close the gap between someone who has the potential but that can't access the opportunity, that you're going to bridge that lacuna. So when you are designing policy to do that, it's usually going to be very specific. You're going to try to target beneficiaries based on that opportunity, which means it's not going to be a kind of a blanket dispensation of some kind of benefit. It's going to be a targeted dispensation of a very particular form of intervention. Um, and so, that's, I think, the only sort of responsible kind of intelligent way in which you could do something that supposedly wants to do something like affirmative action does, whereas affirmative action literally has everything, it's destroying the foundation of morality. It's destroying the foundation of a common decent society in order to achieve a superficial end, which ends up being discredited by its own procedure of affirmative action. So it ends up being completely toxic. But anyway, there are more general ways in which this form of toxicity can be viewed, and I want to get into that because I think that we should be able to recognize how leftist policy has made people's lives worse, and it has made people's lives worse by destroying culture, by destroying functional culture, by destroying the notion of responsibility, of individual responsibility within culture. And I think that uh, they have generated many sort of little subcultures, little toxic subcultures within their field of operation. And this has also happened from feminism, I think. So, but also, I would say, generally the black community because of the welfare state. That the state of the black family and the state of the or you could call it the black subculture. Black subculture never used to be that uh, uh, in America. It never used to be that distinct from the rest of the culture. I mean, the also the kind of the level of crime and or just the general feeling of safety and well-being, how these things have changed within 50, 60 years. Um, and what has caused this degeneration? I would say that, it has been essentially the undermining of this individual responsibility within culture, which creates these weird sort of perverse incentives to cast all the problems that you have not as individual obstacles but as systemic oppression, which is somewhat endorsed by the kind of interventionism that the lefty sort of ideological stance takes and the lefty worldview takes. And I don't think that policy is made accountable enough for the wreckage that it has caused and the damage that has caused to generating a toxic culture that it has left in its wake. And you can kind of see how it, almost like a cancer, seeks to threaten and take over and destroy sort of a whole society. Um, I mean, it's interesting as well that another reflection of this you could see is how the problem of drugs in California and homelessness. Like something has gone wrong there, and it has gone wrong worse in California than it has in other states. So there is definitely something about policy that is precipitating these generally pathological um, outcomes and occurrences or whatever. And I would say it is damage that has been done to culture. Yeah, I didn't make that argument as forcefully and as I'd imagined that I might. But it's hard to trace this to the abstract philosophical mechanism that I'm seeing in operation here. But essentially, there is this perverse incentive to recast and reinterpret reality not as having to apply the requisite amount of personal or individual responsibility um, for overcoming obstacles when you can just essentially interpret those obstacles as being elements of systemic oppression. And I mean, what's worse is, in some sense, anyone can do this. You don't need almost an excuse to do this. Anyone can use this philosophy. And in fact, intersectional identity politics is almost trying to unbridle this mechanism from groupthink to some degree by trying to supply a kind of a generalist groupthink that everyone is allowed to freely use this philosophical mechanism, which is a kind of, I would say, sort of like a bad faith engine, which they want everyone to install, which is that it doesn't matter if there aren't many people who suffer in the same way as what you're trying to interpret as systemic oppression. You don't need to be supported by the collective, because we've got this collective ideology which says we're all allowed to do it for ourselves. We're all allowed to freely interpret any obstacle that we come across as a facet of systemic oppression. And this essentially incentivizes a kind of a recessive relation to culture, that culture then is no longer about adopting more and more responsibility in being empowered and having self-confidence in growing one's capabilities within a cultural domain, as it were, in which one is an equal participant, although one might have differing amounts of cultural um, uh, you could say that there's a different amount of cultural stoicism which each person might be, which might be required to have. And it's unfair that the kind of stoicism that I have to have in cultures is a different bundle to the kind of stoicism that somebody else might have to have. And and so you can say, well, some people, it's so stacked against them that then they're obviously incentivized to just sort of giving up and saying that, they're systemically oppressed. But in concept, there's very little um, uh, there's very little difference. I mean, it's a difference in quantity, not in quality, in some sense. And I mean, I think people know that this is the difference between people with strong characters and people with weak characters. And in some sense, I think that the strength of some of one's character, although it may have been tested differently in terms of culture, still seems to shine through as an independent facet of their being. That the amount of capability they have for taking responsibility might not have ever been proven during their lifetime, but it's sort of I mean, this has to do with judging people's character, which is almost a kind of an aesthetic or a subjective overlay onto this. But I do think that people do respond, and I think this is what people refer to as charisma in some sense, or it's at least perhaps an element of charisma. But anyway, um, the propensity for one to make an independent interface within their cultural surroundings and environment as an equal participant, as regarding themselves as you see, and just because you're an equal participant in culture doesn't mean that you are awarded some equal unit of quantity of cultural power. That's not what it is. In some sense, cultural power will always be asymmetrical, and in some sense, it will be not based on it'll be based on the style of participation that you have, not based on some sort of resource base that you're born into or inherited or granted. In some sense, people's potential power, if they do, let's say for a moment you adopt some of the concepts of like a disadvantaged group or something like that. In some sense, those people have extra cultural power because they have potential to tap into, they have potential to assume and place upon themselves. They have the kind of they have a reach and they have an access which is unfulfilled, which in the motion of them actually um, broaching those or essentially transforming their identity, which I don't take that as a serious benchmark, because I don't think that's um, but yeah, essentially the notion of culture itself has been bastardized in order to facilitate the leftist interface. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree, because the level to which you denigrate the individual's participation in culture, or you are pessimistic or cynical about um, the potential access which culture enables the individual to self-actualize within, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it creates this kind of this perverse incentive to not be motivated, and therefore to prove the narrative of systemic oppression. So which then and then essentially the only thing that politics becomes about is about channeling sympathy towards claims against the system and preferential claims against the system, while everyone has to give up free access to culture in order to accommodate this top-down interventionism, which almost has to kind of regulate and determine everyone's decision-making, that you're not allowed autonomous decision-making within culture anymore. It has to be done for you in a kind of in a corroborated way, with policy that is going to use culture as the remedy, use culture as the medium of dispensing social justice, to undo the systemic discrimination, in inverted commas, while at the same time completely steamrolling culture into just another political field of yeah, and this is my definition of fascism, is that when culture itself becomes um, within the political wheelhouse of that essentially that government is tasked also with essentially policing culture and maximizing culture towards uh, some sort of moral picture or some sort of objective. Um, I'm not going to sort of deal with a slight paradox there, but because it's tangential. But yeah, I mean, I have noticed this, that in this way as well, in terms of the systemic oppression spiel and the systemic oppression worldview, is that when you can see people intellectually trying to make these kinds of arguments, you can tell also, I mean, part of its toxicity in some sense is that they have this selective memory, and they have this selective sensitivity to information, that certain things somewhat become salient into establishing that paradigm, and certain things are conveniently forgotten and left out of the equation, because you're only going to deal with concepts and broad themes that support it, and you're going to kind of completely jettison everything that doesn't quite conform to that paradigm. And they do this quite flagrantly, so that it's a cherry picked, sort of picture that they are generating in order to support their ethical foundation and their ethical paradigm. Um, and all the consequences of, treating human beings like this and socially engineering culture and society to be prone to this kind of ethical dilemma, which they are essentially generating within their paradigm, um, has to actively suppress answering questions that can be answered, that would put a linchpin in their paradigm. So they have to look at a situation and say, well, I don't actually have to know the answer to that question, because if I just leave that as a question mark, then it keeps my paradigm valid. It keeps the systemic oppression clearly in focus. It doesn't confuse it. They never try to falsify their own sort of ethical prescription. And they have a very particular form of laziness about this. And it's very interesting also seeing the secondary pseudo-intellectualism that tries to cover them for doing this, where they will pretend to debunk things and they will pretend to go down rabbit holes and to come up with very sophisticated answers, and they go through very, sort of convoluted processes of answering certain questions. And, it's sort of the quality of lies, and statistics. Um, where it has this very deep rooted decontextualization of framing the questions so that the technical answers that are derived from those questions still produce that nebulous question mark, uh, uh, and because essentially, like they will not ask questions that are designed to falsify the 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 theme or the picture, or the worldview. They won't even ask questions that, because threatening the worldview, and this is where the tautological aspect of their ideology comes into it, because essentially the conclusions of their narrative are used also to generate the premises of the paradigm, of the narrative. So I mean, it's it's a bad faith machine in some sense, and this is all, I think, also ethically reflected in just the opening sort of gambit, which is that, you know it's hard for people, I think, to see just how poisonous it is to like expand a concept like discrimination into a weird kind of generalization. I mean, you can conceptually do whatever the hell it is that you want to do, but it it's like you've created a different interpretation of reality in which it's very disembodied, it's very abstracted, and you've completely dissolved the individual into a kind of amorphous human condition already. You've already kind of generalized things beyond the level at which psychology operates. And then you end up having these very strange sociological interpretations of people's self-esteem, which are fundamentally insoluble, because you are tethering their self-esteem to a generalization and essentially assuming that they should be racists, assuming that they should be racialists at the very least, but that they should be invested into racist generalizations, and that they should only feel happy about themselves if the power between racist generalizations are roughly equivalent or have equivalent outcomes associated with them. That. So it's this weird kind of paradox that you're endorsing racism as a way to supposedly engineer equality as a means to an end. And you end up with I mean, Hitler would have called these people useful idiots, and this is also why I think Hitler was so successful at co-opting so many communists. Look, there were sections of communists who opposed the fascists, but they did end up helping Hitler in general, and a lot of them, they marched together. Many of them marched together in the Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches. Together they brought down the liberal order, the libertarian values, and the accountability of the electorate was what was essentially being ideologically attacked. that the identity should be infantilized. They both essentially agreed on that. And they both uh, colluded to destabilize the state. And again, Hitler just called these people useful idiots. But yeah, I mean, there are lots of things in how the left is literally inventing or manufacturing racism. They are creating new racism. That's exactly what they are doing. Um, I was thinking about making a recording about sort of debunking lies that have been said, for example, about Trump. Just looking at each of these things. I mean, let me give an example. I want to defend Donald Trump's uh, vilified statement, which was not a public statement, when he referred to shithole countries. Now, first of all, because this was not a public statement, it's unfair to criticize him by saying it's a poor choice of words. I think that's an irrelevant sort of complaint to have. The whole argument should center around what did he mean? But what does shithole country mean? What does that actually refer to? And I mean, I think we should all know what he means when he what such a phrase should mean. Essentially, I mean, and obviously you can elaborate this to some degree or other, but if you have a country that has bad leadership, that the country is not going anywhere, the country is fundamentally destroyed by corruption, essentially, by a corrupt political establishment or elite um, that cannot help the country, cannot help the people in the country, and people can only wish to escape from such a pathetic, sort of hopeless situation. And it's interesting that, I mean, in some sense, you could define shithole country also by, if it is a democracy, that somehow the electorate just keep on electing corrupt leaders. Somehow, in some way or fashion, the electorate ends up voting in new leadership that is just as incapable or inefficient or has mismanagement or corrupt as the last. And so you just get essentially mediocrity and failure. You live in a failed country, essentially. That's what a shithole country is. And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I live in South Africa, and you can't. I mean, we elected a president who was completely corrupt. Um, and to complain that Trump should know that there is such a concept as a shithole country and that he should be honest about it. I mean, that's a level of realism. That's a level of pragmatism. That's also a level of revering, implicitly revering the fact that it's important to have a healthy culture, a healthy political culture, healthy political discourse that has elements of realism in it, which has not been within the political realm until Donald Trump for a very long time. That there has been this kind of surrealist delusion, which has, I think, largely been generated and perpetrated from the so-called left, which has also created the kind of the fodder to conceal much of the corruption. Um, I mean, there are these interesting asymmetries between Republicans and Democrats that, in some sense, they're both as almost corporately captured and corrupt as each other, but in some sense, if the Republicans actually won and got their way in implementing small government, at least supposedly the conservative ideology or the Republican ideology would be self-terminating in terms of the source of its corruption. Not that there are that many Republicans who actually go in that direction. But again, I mean, I guess that's the difference between sort of the ideological face of a party and the actual sort of business on the business as usual on some level. But that's probably that's not really related to the thesis of this recording. But yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I still consider myself some species of Marxist in that I believe that the only way to actually have a real transcendence over capitalism is for people to privately organize something that supplements economic relations, and they do it under their own cultural invention, and they do it consensually, and then they build it themselves in some sense, and they can use the market to buy their freedom from the market collectively in some sense by collecting enough productive resources or whatever, enough production capacity, um, and create a model that people want to join perhaps, and then you have a kind of a peaceful, non-statist, non-revolutionary revolution, which I think is perfectly possible, especially even under the kind of small government Republican kind of way of doing politics. But when you try to do it through the state, and especially when you try to do it by leveraging a toxic culture which destroys values and replaces them with kind of superficial moral pictures, which oh yeah, that was the other thing that I wanted to get into, is how that superficial morality, when you've expanded the definition of discrimination, it creates a level of unaccountability, not only on the level of the individual, but also then it creates this kind of this propensity towards witch hunts and scapegoating, because when you have got unaccounted for accountability, when you've got missing accountability within the system, you need to kind of find a target to, you need to find a boogeyman, you need to find someone to vilify in some sense. And culturally, this makes culture a bit borderline personality disordered. And you can see that a lot of sections of a lot of people with certain dispositions, certain personality temperaments, are predisposed towards playing that game, that cultural game of field marshalling and scapegoating. And these are a lot of the people who right now are under the left, but they would just as easily be under the right. You know, these are the same types of personalities. And this is really the proto fascist sort of sentiment and culture that is being normalized by, at least at the moment, under left wing politics, which is also normalizing the so called ultra right wing, which is still a minority in relation to the, let's say, the left wing racism, which is being normalized. Um, so we've got this very sinister slide in politics. But essentially, that this cultural normalization of these very pathological, you know, sort of modes of conceptualizing society and relating to society with reference to these racialist generalizations, um, you know, creates this whole sort of like magic that can be cast by these sort of demagogic, you know, sort of pundits and things like that, you know. And I mean, you can see them all over YouTube on the left. Um, Destiny, for example, is one of these people. I mean, these people are literally indistinguishable from fascists, culturally speaking. They have the same philosophical interface with society. They just pretend to have equality as their highest ideal and chauvinism as a way to achieving the equality, whereas fascists or full-blown fascists that aren't proto-fascists would just have chauvinism as their highest ideal. And essentially, they also actually do believe in some form of equality, just in the same way that Hitler wanted everyone to have their own ethno-state, because then you could have a kind of community of a weird kind of Cold War that keeps everyone in their place, and forces everyone to advance because of the fear of the other in some sense. Um, Whereas the proto-fascist leftists want to use the fear of the other and using the instrument of chauvinism as a way to kind of accelerate somehow the achievement of equality, which is not even technically possible, because you cannot have a state that equally arbitrates in favor of each identity or towards some point of reset or some point of equilibrium. It just is not going to happen. Um, you cannot serve more than one master, and this is even, you can see this within the cannibalism of identity politics, is that only the person at the top of the stack gets delivered something. And everybody else has to sort of wait their turn or something like that. Um, and sort of in the meantime, what will generally happen is people will move towards segregation, or they'll move towards avoidance, because that is the only way to minimize the friction between the different counterclaims, as it were. Um, that essentially the only way to avoid segregation is by enforcing a groupthink. I mean, this is essentially the only two solutions to in identity politics, but also to the left in general. And I do think that identity politics is an ethical microcosm of the culture of the left, and also of this theory of centralized control, or planning, or centralized planning, that undermines the individual libertarian, sort of impetus that the West is founded on in some sense. Um, is that you either have to encourage some form of segregation, or you have to encourage strict narrative conformity, that everyone has to believe in the same narrative and attest to the same ideological facts, and the same ideological definitions, uh, um, the same ideological truths. And so everyone either has to parrot the same semantic so that there is ostensibly no disagreement, or in order to avoid the invariable disagreements which are inescapable, you cannot not have disagreements, because the semantic definitions that they have set up don't coherently even work together. They self-contradict. It's kind of like you know it's like a song. So if someone starts singing halfway through the song, you have to know all the bars that come after it, and then sing it to the end, and then start from it's more like a recitation of a drama. It's not a coherent web, or it doesn't have a systematic cogency. um, because it doesn't have a good philosophical substantiation. It's fundamentally fudged. That essentially, well, why are you redefining discrimination to be like that? And you know that at some point it has to translate into action. And so, well, who should we say represents the system? Why don't we say that the people on the bottom of the stack of systemic oppression, why don't we say that it's their fault that they are systemically oppressed? Why do we say that it's people at the top of the stack somehow, in terms of relative outcomes? Surely, if it's all based on exploitation, then surely the people that are allowing themselves to be exploited could just collectively stop being exploited and therefore threaten the longevity of the system unless it is, in fact, it's not built on their exploitation, that their participation is not um, being extracted from them, and in some sense that there's another causative explanation as to why all these things happen, and it needs to be tackled on a completely different level, on a completely different conceptual model. You know, and so that they're kind of, I've skipped over things that I wanted to address now. But I mean, essentially, it's an oversimplified moralistic cartoon of reality, and hypnotizing people into believing in that cartoon um, is very toxic, essentially. Um, and it also diverts from actually coming up with real solutions to problems, because these kinds of lowest common denominator, one size fits all sort of condemnations against the system and complaints and accusations against the system, which also necessitate blanket accusations made against whole groups of people, um, is essentially an ideological fiction. You know, it's hypothetical based on a very dark dependence on a kind of on racialist thinking, um, or some kind of identity essentialism, and it kind of and and even though it might even philosophically admit this itself, it excuses itself because it says, well, uh, this is the means to the end, so we can do it anyway, even if it is morally murky or something like that, or even if it is fighting fire with fire. Uh, where essentially the problem is that it wasn't essentially, it's not a combustion fire, it's like it's an electrical fire, and so the whole sort of foundation of their um, that's a bit of a strange metaphor, but anyway, you know, it's a misdiagnosis, but it's also a sort of, it's got a level of sort of viral bad faith built into that misdiagnosis. Um, and I do think that left wing people are not ethically capable of understanding why it is a misdiagnosis, because class class warfare, in some sense, at least in the Marxist hypothesis, um, you know, they are so sensitive to the gripe of um, alienation from the means of production that the proletarians suffer, and that is the trigger that gives them the moral authority or the moral legitimacy to stage a revolution and to try to politically wage some kind of uh, popularization of class consciousness. And I mean, I guess it might also be the fact that that has kind of failed. Um, that ideologically, that recipe is not really tenable, um, because of how history has sort of gone its way with Leninism or something like that, which has kind of destroyed that to some degree, but also as the examples of the USSR. Um, which, you know, I mean, in some sense, you know, you can argue that maybe it shouldn't be such a negative example because it wasn't a mature capitalist society. Um, but again, I think that the way around this is just to not have a statist revolution. Uh, to be a non-revolutionary Marxist, I think is completely possible. I mean, you know, you can be paranoid and say, well, you're going to be crushed by people infiltrate the CIA will infiltrate you, or you'll be assassinated, or something like that. But I think that kind of pessimism and cynicism as an excuse for claiming central power is really it's not really excusable. I don't think that that holds up. I mean, there are ways and means of doing things. You know, you can use the internet to publicize what it is that you're doing. You know, there are ways of communicating your plight, and you know. So I mean, if you, you know, I mean, look, maybe you will be crushed, maybe by some kind of fascistic secret arm of some government or something like that. Um, but I think that, you know, I think that there are ways of doing things where you don't have to be crushed if someone attempts to crush you, where you could successfully defend the thing. You could actually plan to do it in such a way so that there are measures of security built into what you're doing, that you have sort of built in, let's say, publicity to protect yourself. You know, there's actual strategy, there's actual, you know, there's something to be said about doing something the right way, um, and actually, uh, you know, I mean, this idea that no, you want to guarantee that your ideology is going to be sacrosanct and is going to sort of be protected and insulated, that this is going to be the end of history or something like that, instead of actually having to do anything, that you just want it to be, you just want to claim it as a moral justice, you know, sort of thing, rather than just doing something well, you know, or doing something, taking responsibility for possibilities that things might not go your way. You know, the, I really don't have sympathy for these kinds of revolutionaries who, to me, seem very, you know, in some sense to be kind of spoilt, and have this kind of, I mean, you can see why so many revolutionaries, at least at the current, in the contemporary arena, are essentially stooges for plutocrats and corrupt elites, because their revolutionary ideology is essentially, is lockstep with promoting a form of unaccountable politics that can be disguised in the superficial moral picture that completely undermines normative values and normative ethics, to make room for that kind of fudged and sloppy moral thinking. Um, so yeah, in some sense, I think identity politics might be, it might be good that we're going through this, because in some sense, if identity politics is defeated, so will leftism, in a moral way. And I think that that's almost how it needs to be seen, is that the reason why the left can't repudiate identity politics is because, um, and that is perhaps the difference between the people on the left who do stand against it, like Brett Weinstein, who knows that there's something wrong with it, um, is because he has already kind of accepted the fact that you have to kind of make peace with capitalism. And so that's really the distinction in the radical left, is that people who have made peace with capitalism, or are capable of assimilating some kind of armistice with capitalism, and people who still want a complete command economy and a planned economy. And the people who essentially are still happy with having a completely sort of controlled society, um, sort of can't help but latch on to identity politics. It's too much of a moral advancement in the theme of their paradigm. Okay, so that's okay. At least that is that point across, I think. I mean, which has essentially always been sloppy. I mean, this is something that I'm not going to get into that well, but I mean, someone who I think has been politically vilified for much too long, and I think if you look at the history of Pinochet in Chile, um, if you if you actually talk to people in Chile and you ask them about the legacy of Pinochet, just anyone who is slightly informed, and I would even think that even to a lot, I mean, to a large extent, many people within any population will be generally not that informed and will just go along. But essentially, I think if you ask the majority of anyone who is slightly politically interested, so I mean, I guess on the question it would be like, would you consider yourself politically informed or to follow politics and and the structure of politics or something like that. So you create one simple filter about like, do you actually read politics, or do you actually investigate or research to any you know in that it's part of your interests. One of your active interests is to be interested in politics. I think the majority of people would say that the legacy of Pinochet and just how necessary a figure he was, and yes, um, there probably were people that were tortured, and they were probably, but these weren't sort of just random people. These were far leftists, and I'm not saying that it's good to. Um, I'm not saying that it's good to contravene people's human rights or whatever, but in some sense, uh, in the future, I think Pinochet will be seen in a different light, because he was, you know, how the state is organized, and how, he was, I would say, ahead of his time in terms of politics. And so he did not have solutions available to him. He did not have an enlightened international legal framework to assist against defending against an insurgency that was slow cooking a democracy, that was essentially destroying democracy from the inside. And this is why I get so pissed off about my country, because my country has a very forward thinking constitution, which, as far as I can see, has been completely betrayed by the political elites who have used this very disgusting racialist ideology in order to forward their unaccountable politics. And that's essentially why I live in a failing country. But and I want to project that kind of context onto Pinochet, and to be more sympathetic to him. But he only had the means available to him, and I mean, it's probably the only example in history of a dictator who literally precipitated democracy after he got out of the way, after he did what he set out to do. A very purpose driven sort of coup, as it were. um, and people call him fascist, and then they've redefined fascism to be essentially the sticking up for business or something like that. I mean, this is complete rewriting of history. This is ideological nonsense. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. The idea that Hitler was trying to stand up for the factory owners in Germany or something like that is just it's retarded. I mean, it, fascism is about um, I mean, you could even call it, it's a version of identitarianism, but it's a kind of ethno um, family. It's believing that the nation is a has a kind of family value. Uh, the unit of the nation is a family of conserving uh, some kind of purity or something like that, or about exalting a a kind of a mythology around everyone belonging to a collective family. Uh, and I think that what Pinochet did could actually be recast as a defense of democracy. Very, I mean, just and that is even borne out by the facts in inverted commas. And you can say, well, how democratic is it to defend democracy from a political movement that is trying to gain democratic legitimacy to end democracy? So I guess you can kind of throw that kind of liberal paradox out, that a liberal democracy is itself legitimately vulnerable to having its democracy um, terminated. So I mean, I'm not going to get into, but I mean, that's the kind of sophistry, that's the kind of casuistry. Very bad at pronouncing that word. That you get from um, so in some sense, I see that Pinochet Pinochet acted before the leftists acted, because he essentially didn't want the country to go the way of Venezuela, because he saw the future, and it was Venezuela, and he said no, it would be better to avoid that fate. That's how you can. I think that is how, if you're going to argue that Pinochet is a bad guy, I think you have to actually seriously contest what I'm laying out now. That Pinochet anticipated that it was going to be a Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela happened after the fact. I'm just using it as a metaphor, essentially. But that was the future that Pinochet um, predicted, and then he changed the future, and he subverted that devastating future, and he acted essentially to now, obviously, uh, it everything can be done better in some way, but I mean, I think that there probably is a lot of exaggeration in terms of the so-called fascist elements, and certainly I guess you could probably call him, his dictatorship, I guess, had totalitarian elements. Um, but it was interesting because it was not totalitarian so much in controlling thought, in as much as it was persecuting leftism. So it definitely persecuted so-called Marxist or socialist elements, or radical left elements. It certainly persecuted those things, but in some sense, it did not, in a totalitarian way, try to enforce an ideology. It certainly didn't sort of didn't try to inculcate an ultra right ideology. In some sense, it, it it wanted to maintain, let's say, normal politics, in inverted commas, normal democratic politics, while trying to excise the far left. Um, and the thing is that the far left does have its way of, let's say, slow cooking democracies. It does have its way of slowly infiltrating institutions. And in some sense, I think that the form of the state, it's never been that obvious except in South Africa, because South Africa actually does have a constitution that is a liberal constitution. And so in South Africa, you can actually see this happening now in history, the constitution has been betrayed. We have had this slow cook of democracy, which is essentially what I would call black fascism, the slide into black fascist ideology, which has been masked by leftism, which is exactly what Hitler was. I mean, that's why Hitler had red on his flag, and that's why Nazi has the word socialist in it. National Socialist German Workers' Party. That the Nazis both used the term socialistic or socialism, and they also used the word Workers' Party. So they always brand themselves as of the left. Um, and in some sense, so I mean, okay, I've just called them fascist, and then I've also said that they use the kind of left regalia or something like that. And in some sense, I think that there's very little difference between these two breeds of politics because, well, I mean, whether the government directly controls factories or whether they yeah, I mean, I guess there is some window dressing, but at least in South Africa, it is more left than it is. Well, it's both. I guess in South Africa, the line is completely blurred because um, in some sense they are more ultra left black fascists. I guess uh, where they promise massive um, redistribution, but they will probably also have they'll probably run the urban areas like Hitler ran the economy, um, where you kind of are given monopolies and you're given sort of protection, and then essentially uh, you're extracted. The kind of the bribes and the licenses and things like that. That essentially you become a kind of a cash cow for the political elite to some degree, or to the regime in general. I mean, fascism generally has problems with economics. I mean, Hitler himself only established what he established off essentially taking out huge loans which were never repaid because of the war, essentially. Um, and then you had essentially the war economy that used conquest to uh, supply, sort of its own fiscal or financial deficiencies. Anyway, I've ventured into lots of ancillary sort of points. Let me pack it in, but yeah, I shouldn't have tried to clean up that ideological distinction. It's perhaps not important, but yeah, at least I think the South African Constitution is calibrated well enough. It has enough principles in it that you can see where the lines have been crossed. You can see how academics started spouting this racialist identity politics nonsense, literally betraying the Constitution. Literally, I mean, these academics should be jailed or at least fined, and their public resources. How can a government give money to public institutions that are literally undermining the constitutional values, which are the highest values of the land, and everyone has to essentially adhere to them or fulfill them, or to promote them, and not to literally everyone has a duty not to undermine non-racialism, which is directly undermined by identity politics. So we've got very clear breaches of constitutional duties and responsibilities, which has been, let's say, sanctioned on the highest level, that the Chief Justice himself gives speeches about identity politics. It is disgusting. I mean, it is flagrant betrayal of the Constitution. The and you can see that essentially the ideological propensity, the perverse incentive, because when you can have this kind of unaccountable politics, there, you can just, it's a self-fueling doom spiral that no one has to ever be accountable for policy, because it's more inherited systemic oppression. You can just conflate it with historic residue. It just reinforces the mythology behind the identity, behind this self-esteem that needs to be excavated from history. While self-confidence is never accessible, because you never make people real participants in culture, because culture is completely overcrowded or overshadowed by systemic oppression. And so, you've already created the moral paradigm for the kind of the far left moral position. And so, I mean, what I'll just say to America is that, if you want to, this is the Trump with fight, the fight with Trump against the Democratic Party and the mainstream media, which is kind of on the side of the Democratic Party. That is, if you don't find a way to diffuse that, to challenge that, to confront that, and to eventually dissolve that, and to have some kind of perhaps McCarthyist intervention in terms of clearing the stuff out of your education system, your future is South Africa. You're going to have the same level of unaccountable politics. You're going to have the same slow cook of democracy, which I think South Africa is the biggest, is the most detailed example of this. If you actually have a nuanced mind to looking at details and picking through these things and not just grabbing onto the headlines, because you get these academics all over the world who say, who echo this thing, which then gets repeated by stupid people within our country, within my country, South Africa, that, what has caused a problem is the neoliberal economics. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. This is just ludicrous nonsense that liberal economics has been the reason why our country has not developed. We haven't developed because of corruption. We haven't developed because of mismanagement and inefficiency, because we have unaccountable politics. That's why we haven't developed. Because the parasite that is the ANC government is much too large and is much too ideologically invested into essentially bribing its supporters in an unsustainable way, in an unsustainable model in which it doesn't matter, because any lack of responsibility that they have over dispensing their political responsibilities can just be scapegoated because of identity politics. It's disgusting. It's a self-fueling destabilization machine. It is, and then you get that secondary economy of pseudo intellectuals who will just sort of repeat the mantra, oh, it's neoliberal economics, it's neoliberal economics. I mean, if you just on a purely sort of accounting level, it doesn't matter if something is done by the public sector or done by the private sector. It matters how much money does it cost, and what was the value of the services provided, and then by that division, by that ratio of how much did it cost and how much was provided, you understand how efficient it was, and you understand that the public sector is not efficient in South Africa because it's corrupt and it's full of mismanagement. It's full of inefficiency, essentially. And so obviously we're not going to develop, because all the money or the capital that would have gone into development has gone into inefficient running of things that, I mean, if you look at how many times the South African Airlines, which is a state-owned enterprise, has been bailed out, this thing has failed more times than, I mean, it's crazy. And they won't let it fail. They won't say, okay, well, we don't know how to run an airline, or we're running it so inefficiently that it's a waste of money. They still bail it out, because that is also how corruption happens. Because every time it fails because it's had money badly dealt, or it's contracts, and it's it's just it's an organ of parasitic extraction of wealth from the taxpayer in some sense. And I mean, not to mention just education. I mean, the amount of money that goes into education is huge, and the quality of education in South Africa is terrible. And again, there's no political accountability for this. Somehow this gets blamed on apartheid or something like that. I mean, you can't even get education right with the amount of money that you're spending on it. We're not getting the value of what we're spending on education. And somehow that is the fault of history. It's not the fault of bad management. You can't, if you don't have accountability, there is no future, essentially. And this is how ideology works. The left ideology works, is that you find a kind of a gap in accountability, and then you just kind of exacerbate it, and then you portray it as a symptom, a natural symptom of capitalism or something like that, of the status quo, where they were the ones who essentially infiltrated the status quo and corrupted it. So yeah, we're in that kind of we're dealing with those kinds of, I mean, I guess I would call them insurgents. And there is a cultural parallel to this, which is that there are people who have psychological temperaments, who have personalities that love this stuff. It's almost as if they know that it's a parasitic source of narcissistic supply or something. They know that it's a kind of sophistry which, that they are fulfilling a secondary economy for some, kind of political, so it's a way to kind of be part of a team that has a broad coalition, and they're plutocrats attached to that. So what people don't understand is these people that aren't interested in debating in real substance, who dishonestly frame issues and ethical issues, are essentially part of fueling, the unaccountable plutocrats at the end of the day, because they're providing the cover, they're providing the means of virtue signaling, they're providing the superficial moral picture, which covers over all these things. I mean, there's never been a better example than in South Africa, when you have black economic empowerment is what is used to facilitate corruption, because you don't have to say that this person actually made the best tender. You don't. It's not based on who provides the most efficient or cost-effective um, contract to government. Government chooses it on the basis of their credential of how much that they are owned by black ownership or something like that. And so, if you're going to have that kind of automatic um, prejudice or chauvinism or bias or whatever, well, why not choose people who are politically connected to you? And I mean, the disgusting thing is that these people don't even end up doing the actual contract work. It's all subcontracted anyway. So that, the people who actually efficiently bidded for the tender, they end up doing the work anyway, because they're subcontracted by the people who did win the bid, and then that surplus is just pocketed by someone who did nothing. I mean, it's crazy. And I mean, and does this precipitate progress? Does this facilitate transformation? No, it doesn't. It's just unsustainable wastage. It's a waste of resources. I mean, rather put those resources into developing something, or helping people actually acquire skills or something like that, or subsidizing some kind of training program or something like that, would be way better in terms of actually affecting transformation. But instead, these people, they don't want to bridge any gap between potential and opportunity. That's not what they're interested in. It's just a kind of, but I mean, essentially, under identity politics, this nuance and accountability it goes out the window. In fact, the more that's wasted, the more that you destabilize the system, the more that you discredit the system, and you create the impetus towards having a greater command economy. That's counted as a win, because then the politicians get a hold of even more resources. They get to be in control of even, so they're essentially rewarded for their own failure. The worse they are at their job, the greater of a moral excuse they have for controlling more things. Because their excuse is that, well, we need more radical reform and we don't have the power for radical reform. we can only solve these problems if we're given more control, if business will listen to us more, if business will take our mandates seriously, never mind that the mandates are shrinking the economy and shrinking the tax base, which is already a kind of an overtaxed, over leveraged, everything is just, I mean, it's so badly mismanaged. I mean, obviously these things are much worse than the American situation, but I mean, it is a model of the future if you go down this route, and you can even, I think, using the South African Constitution as a benchmark, and it is a much better constitution, and it is a much better system of law. The structural foundations of the institutions in South Africa are probably the most advanced in the world. Um, but they have been betrayed, and now we are also generating legal positivism, because essentially the form of law is being corrupted in order to facilitate what is essentially more and more fascistic politics. I mean, there are some general missteps that have happened within the development of South African law, but essentially they are also unconstitutional. But anyway, I'm not going to go into some of the. Actually, I will add this one tangent, although it has nothing to do with this whole topic, is that at some point they started amending the Constitution to change things, like how Parliament is set up to facilitate floor crossing and things like that. What they should have instead done is all the changes that they wanted to make, they should have made in separate legislation that was secondary, what's called secondary legislation, because it's secondary, second to the Constitution. That it's better than normal legislation, but it's seen as sort of facilitating the expression of the Constitution. Or they should have created. Okay, technically it shouldn't have been secondary legislation. It should have been. They should have created their own class of new legislation, which is something on the same caliber as secondary legislation, but technically it doesn't have the same definitional requirements, because you're actually adding things that have nothing to do with what was already existing in the Constitution. But I guess maybe you could make the argument that it's secondary legislation because it's helping clear up issues of how rules within Parliament should be followed and such. Anyway, that they should have created essentially a body of how Parliament is going to regulate itself through legislation, and not have it in the Constitution, because the Constitution is not something that should be updated and changed. It should just be left alone. And that if you want to create how to do something that is roughly described in the Constitution, if you want to create an expression of something that is roughly outlined in the Constitution, do it in something else, and then change that thing if you want to change it, or debate over that thing and refine that thing. Stop touching the Constitution, basically. That is how it should have been done. That you shouldn't have had this, okay, well, now we've come up with how to do this, and because it has to do with Parliament, well, let's just stick it into the Constitution. It's not necessary. I think that already kind of created this false consciousness in politics about the standing of the Constitution, that it's just a democratic, that essentially, just as the Nazis thought that essentially we make the law, we just change the law whenever we feel like it. So essentially, all the law is their living constitution. I mean, our constitution, I don't know if you can call it a living document necessarily, because I think the values are pretty concrete. But in as much as that it has any kind of living document connotation, I mean, that's for the judiciary. That's not for Parliament. That's not for the plenary. Anyway, that's a very sort of technical sort of point, but I mean, yeah, it has precipitated this corrupt culture of legal positivism that essentially if the law says that we can do it, we can do it, and we're allowed to change the constitution whenever we feel like it. Which actually Parliament is not allowed to change the constitution. There are provisions to amend the constitution, but those amendments, I think, have to be taken as a separate interpretation of the original constitution. And I know this is going to sound a bit strange. This is a weird, let's say, interpretation of South African law to some people, but you have to understand that the Constitution is not an act of Parliament. It was not passed as an act of Parliament. The Constitution was passed by the Constitutional Assembly. Now, the product of the Constitutional Assembly, which was the adoption of the Constitution, also then became an act of Parliament, but the act of Parliament is not the Constitution. So please understand the distinction here. And so, inasmuch as the Constitution can be amended by Parliament, we still have to realize that we have to understand what an amendment to the Constitution is in that context, because you cannot change what the Constitutional Assembly passed. So what you have to then say is what the parliamentary procedure of amendment to the Constitution is it is a translation of the original Constitution. You have to say that it's a kind of it's to give greater effect to the original Constitution in some sense. And this is why the Constitution cannot bear amendment that contradicts its original purport. It certainly can't support anything that contradicts its original founding values. Even as Parliament is given a certain threshold that it is allowed to amend those. Again, amendment, I think, here needs to actually be taken in context to the setup that I've just described. That it's you can't change what the Constitutional Assembly adopted. You can add to it in a way that essentially gives expression to what's already there. So when it says that you can amend the Constitution, that's just general language, but essentially you can only amend it by adding things to it that enhance what's already there. That is my general argument. So in some sense, it is beyond, in the same way that the American Constitution can be amended by you add the amendment at the end and it doesn't change the original text. It's the same, it's literally the same setup. This setup, though, is not, let's say, made explicitly, but it's made implicitly by the fact that Parliament did not make the Constitution. The Constitutional Assembly adopted the Constitution, and that is an immutable historical claim. If you want to have another Constitutional Assembly, you have to do the requisite to do that, which is essentially you have to have a revolution, and you have to do the same procedure, where you have to ask for. You have to go through the whole thing again, because it's not a parliamentary document. It doesn't belong to parliamentarians. It belongs to the people, as represented by the Constitutional Assembly, which is not a body that can simply be reinitialized. So I'm just going to make that argument there. I know that this is completely not related to the general thesis, but it's a South African context. It is. I mean, I'm saying this now because I'm thinking very much about the political future in South Africa and potentially the partitioning of the country into provinces, or at least the Western Cape leaving the Union of South Africa and the Union of Provinces because of defending the Constitution under the aegis of the fact that the Constitution has now been bastardized and betrayed to the point at which it is de facto no longer the Constitution, and therefore to preserve the Constitution and the supremacy of the Constitution, the Western Cape will declare independence. Obviously, that will have to be democratically mandated as well. That will have to be democratically ratified in some kind of plebiscite within the Western Cape and perhaps other provinces that might join that particular declaration. Uh, it is interesting how such. I mean, I don't know exactly the procedure that I would recommend to facilitate that. Obviously, I would want to do it legally, and have to work out a legal theory about how to do that, which means essentially it would be focused on the judges, the High Court judges. We would have to get some kind of quorum of judges, I would say, to endorse the legal theory or the procedure of independence. And then also there would have to be the requisite support in essentially some kind of, at least at the moment, the existing democratic institutions would have to have at least some kind of inclination towards going along with it until it's democratically ratified by some kind of plebiscite. So, I mean, I guess perhaps also not a referendum, but a perhaps that could be also how to do it, is to judicially enforce the legitimacy of holding a referendum, and then on the back of the result of the referendum moving forward. I mean, obviously, the biggest problem will be how to. I mean, because it would even be good perhaps to separate as soon as possible, because the debt, the national debt, is only going to accelerate at an exceeding pace from now on. So it would be much better to take our portion of the national debt already and then just have to pay that off fiscally as an independent province, rather than continuing to be part of the union and then at some point declaring independence in the future. Then the debt will have already probably, we would have already fallen off the debt trap might be impossible to escape at that point, which it does look like that we're heading in that direction, that it's inevitable. But at least with independence, it would be possible that the Western Cape would no longer be, would at least under intelligent government, or some kind of prudent um, uh, sort of politically responsible accountability, that we wouldn't go the same way as the rest of the country, which would, um, which is probably going to, because when the economic situation gets to a state of utter devastation, then the fascists will have essentially nothing holding them back from perhaps even perpetrating a coup. So if the health of the nation cannot be protected because politics is just fundamentally predisposed to being unaccountable because of the ideological tensions of the fascists, essentially, generated by the fascists. You're not. It certainly is a mess. Anyway, scary things ahead. Okay, this is just a small addendum just to emphasize some key points that maybe I didn't clearly state the first time around. Is that I think it is actually slightly dubious to call Pinochet totalitarian, because he did not impose an orthodox ideology. He was just persecuting what he considered to be a threat to democracy. And perhaps you can say that my historical reading is much too convenient or overly sympathetic. So let me just lean into that and go even further and say that I think that the reason why he tortured people, or why he ordered the torture of people, um, is because he was trying to do the least invasive thing to remove the radical left threat. And there were many, let's say, I think it has to do with almost psychology, that you get these radical leftists, and as I described, they are like these field marshals, and they're into this, this ethical, contemplative, sort of toxic sort of thing of generalizing problems and turning them into systemic conditions or whatever. And it's a very easy way to live inside that narrative. It's a very morally convenient way to live, and people won't give it up. It's a useful intellectual tactic to pull, because if people will respect you for making it, or if people if essentially you can use it to insulate your beliefs, because you don't have to have your beliefs questioned if you can just say hysterically that you are morally superior. And so I think what the torture was designed to do was to crack that edifice, which I think that you could do for most of its adherents. That, for example, I think Destiny would crack under torture, perhaps. I mean, this is okay. This is going to sound really too perverse, I guess. That I'm fantasizing about torturing YouTube personalities for their political beliefs. But anyway, I'm just putting this in a historical context, of Chile. But the thing is that I think that they. I mean, look, I can't say this in every case, but I think in some sense, perhaps they tried to torture people and work out if they could basically depoliticize them, if they could essentially scare them away from politics. And I think going through something like torture is obviously an inhumane sort of treatment, but I think that it was used in order to bully people out of the idealism of far left politics in some sense. And perhaps some people you couldn't do that to, and those were the people that were killed. I'm not saying that this wasn't savage or whatever. And in some sense, I think that Pinochet, in some, I mean, not to excuse his actions, but to explain them, he had no alternative. He had no other way of drawing a line in the sand and saying, you have you are promoting a corrupt ethical normative system that undermines normative values and undermines normative ethics. You've created a narrative. You've created a story for society to live within, that is a kind of proto-totalitarian ideology, and that is why I'm removing you, or why I'm depoliticizing you, or why I'm going to essentially deprogram you with torture. And if I can't deprogram you, then I'm going to kill you, because I don't, this is too dangerous. You're corrupting too much of culture, or something like that. Now, again, I've already said that this is prone to a kind of democratic paradox, that perhaps it's legitimate that democracy should be vulnerable to terminating itself. Um, anyway, I'm not going to touch on that subject now, but let me just say that this kind of issue that Pinochet was into, I certainly, I in some sense, I think he was acting out of a kind of pragmatic necessity. So that's why I'm sympathetic to Pinochet. In the South African context, I think we're in a much more morally clear, we're in a much more transparent society, because in the South African context, we actually have a constitution that has these nuances built into it, that has the ethical normative standards very clearly delineated, which weren't delineated in the Chilean legal system, because they just, well, I've already said that I believe that South Africa has the most advanced legal system in the world, and the most enlightened structure in its institutions. Anyway, so Chile obviously didn't have that, but they still had to deal with this ethical problem. And as I've described, radical leftism has the slow cook effect, that it infiltrates a culture, that it toxifies a culture. So putting that in the South African context, the South Africa is actually capable of saying, you actually have crossed the line. You have betrayed the Constitution. You have actually damaged the Constitution, and it's inexcusable. So at least there is actually an ethical compass in the South African context that you can say, look, you have actually contravened the value of non-racialism. You have undermined the value of non-racialism, which is a founding constitutional value in the South African context. So, and which I think is also the kind of the moral argument that one can also make to try to de-radicalize these people. I do think that it is possible. It's still might not be easy, but it is possible to deprogram these people. Um, and if there is a chance to do it, there's a greater chance of doing it within the South African context. I mean, the problem to a large extent is that this toxic culture is so pseudo intellectual. It is so convenient. It is so easy to live in that narrative. You know, it's easy to be a racist. It's easy to use generalizations in your moral thinking. It's convenient to do so. And to kind of take a step back from that, you have to recognize all the things that you have implicitly done in the ethical domain or whatever, and you have to have a broader respect for ethics, which is, which South Africa again is in a stronger position because of the constitution, because the constitution was there before this toxicity was let loose in society in some sense, and reinvigorated a kind of a radical left wing re-emergence or a kind of ideological re-emergence. Okay, so yeah, the other point that I wanted to re-emphasize, which is something I just kind of already just touched on, which is that um, that how radical leftism essentially slow cooks a democracy and destroys the liberal values that underpin an open democracy is essentially an ethical corruption. It is a corruption of normative ethics. And that is really the best way of reducing um, or at least identifying the slide into it's very interesting, this convoluted moral corruption, in that everywhere you can see in the modern time, you see these slogans, you see these mantras, like believe in yourself, is kind of some of the propaganda. And it's very interesting because what that actually means, if you have any kind of identity politics sentiments, if you have the kind of the woke narrative in your mind, what believe in yourself means is it means believe in your identity and get self-esteem from your identity, which makes you a slave to, having to combat, some kind of boogeyman of some weird nebulous generalization of systemic oppression. Never mind like actually having practical obstacles that you have to overcome in your own interface and culture and your own, real, reality, and sort of navigating those obstacles by holding yourself accountable and by seeing if you can overcome them, instead of testing to see how you might overcome them or how you might grow or develop or whatever. Instead, it's just, no, my identity should already have a built-in self-esteem that I feel, which makes, or anyway, that is the Nietzschean slave morality, if there ever was an example. But yeah, anyway, so if you get enough people programmed that way to be that kind of impressionable, at least politically impressionable sheep, then yeah, I mean, in some sense, they become the real sort of problem in some sense, because it's like they never really had a full understanding of what it is that they were following to begin with, but they quite like the simplicity, they quite like the safety of the narrative. They might not be able to understand how the narrative is constructed, but in some vague conceptual way, they are comforted by it, because essentially it entrenches a kind of an external locus of control that they can always blame some scapegoat for not facilitating, for not politically underpinning or something like that. And then essentially you've got, your culture has generally fallen to the fascistic bug in some sense. But yeah, I mean, I guess those people, those sorts of people, I don't think that they are a majority in some sense. I think maybe you'll be 20% of only 20% of a population will sort of fall into that category, and they might sort of cotton on to whatever the cultural hegemon is. Whatever is in fashion, they will just kind of see themselves as doing the same thing. But in some sense, I guess, once they've experienced, let's say, this depravity, this ethical depravity, which manifests to them as a safe narrative, or because, hypothetically, that narrative, if you can just find someone who will guard that narrative, who will provide that narrative to them, who will pander or and cater to them and propel that narrative and upkeep it, then all they have to do is find someone who will promise to fulfill that function, and everything else, essentially their responsibility, their political responsibility to upkeeping themselves in some sense has been fulfilled by that infantilism. Um, and once you have that expectation within a political arena, I think you have essentially lost any kind of democratic culture. You've lost the sort of the underpinning of democracy. And I mean, I still think it is a minority in most societies. And I mean, but this is essentially the kind of the toxic culture which the left essentially, this is how they slowly infiltrate a society, is by growing that, by normalizing that kind of way of interfacing in politics. Um, there are nuances here that I have to sort of actually mention to clean up some of the stuff, because there are, let's say, I mean, I think if you listen to what I'm saying with some amount of charity and good faith or whatever in following, the, I know there are these ancillary sort of philosophical technical quibbles which aren't real problems, but some people might technically think are problems, which is that, well, if you say that everyone, they come in this. I mean, I don't think that these are real quibbles. These are kind of hype. You know, it's ironic that essentially the kind of the kind of um, technical skepticism which is leveraged against my position is generally of this kind of toxic left culture, which is, these strange sorts of arguments that, well, aren't you just, if you're saying that everyone has to be independent, like you describe, everyone has to have this ethical paradigm, then aren't people dependent on you in order to be responsible or to have individual normative ethics or something like that? Or, how can you say that these people are really individuals and that they don't have an external locus of control if they're dependent on being taught these structures or something like that? And I mean, I've this doesn't follow on quite in a secular fashion from all the issues that I was talking about, but just to kind of phrase that kind of level of critique in that vague way. And essentially, the thing is that this kind of responsibility thing, this having this internal locus of control, um, is essentially a positive structure. It's not, having an external locus of control is not caused by having a problem. It's caused by not having a positive development, a positive cultural inculcation. It's something that you can get from culture, something that your culture can teach you. It's something that can be imparted to you, sort of through osmosis to some degree. So it can be lacking from the environment, but also some people do innately have it as well. And this is, I think, just because, well, I mean, it's not, I believe I know the answer to this question, but this is a different sort of topic. But this has to do with personality style and the different circuitry in psychology, essentially. And some people will just innately, because of their personality circuitry, it will invariably involve developing independent thinking and an internal locus of control. So some people will kind of have an internal locus of control somewhat innate in their psychology, whereas other people will have a different kind of psychology, and they can still have an internal locus of control, but it has to somewhat be installed as a kind of, as a cultural, it has, they have to model it with the circuitry that they do have. They have to create that independence that has to be modeled into the circuitry that they do have, but they have to kind of absorb it from a source. So it has to be taught to them. There has to be some kind of pedagogy within the society. There has to be some kind of normative values that is exhibited to people, like Aesop's fables or something like that, at a certain age, and then at a certain age you start to talk more directly about normative ethics and normative values. Um, anyway, and so because essentially our culture generally is so degenerated that we just kind of operate at the lowest common denominator, that to a large extent most people have a kind of a toxic relationship to moral authority. Their idea of moral authority is indistinguishable almost from raw power, because that is how their parents exhibited it to them, how their parents never sort of revealed a kind of humility on the level of ethical responsibility, and was angry, and or was the kind of unsubstantiated moral authority which was claimed by their parents, sort of in a in an associated way poisoned even the notion of moral authority into a kind, creating weird connotations within people. Um, and so moral authority was kind of conflated with essentially control over commanding people or something like that. Who knows? Anyway, that isn't necessarily the uh, is not that isn't to say that that is the reason why people don't have an internal locus of control. I'm saying that uh, that even if you didn't have that negative impression, you might still not have an internal locus of control, because an internal locus of control has to be developed in a positive structure. It's not just that if you didn't have that kind of, let's say, moral abuse, the kind of moral abuse that Stefan Molyneux talks about quite a lot. It's not that that moral abuse displaces it. It's just that that is what people had instead of positive instruction. That even without that abuse, you would not necessarily get people that have an internal locus of control. You still need to positively inculcate normative values. Um, anyway, and a lot of people do seem to have a hybridized use of both. That sometimes they do know what responsibility is, but it exists within a sphere which is quite tiny sometimes, or quite convoluted, in where these spheres of responsibility exist, and then everything else is a kind of systemic oppression, where there's this kind of, it depends on the subject, it depends on the area within the subject. where there's this strange distinction. And so in some subjects, people have this kind of perverse incentive to not ask questions that would falsify essentially their conjecture of systemic oppression. It's a kind of it's a self delusion. It's a self um, uh, uh, it's a sort of is a self imposed mind forged manacle essentially. I mean, the way that I've described this in some of my other recordings is that you have to understand that culture is like you have to really see it as a joint and severable blame, that you blame yourself, that individually you blame yourself for the state of culture. That gives you the maximum efficacy and for renegotiating culture, at least in your immediate vicinity. And let's say the proof of that responsibility is not is essentially is accepting the outcome as resultant of your decision making, of holding your decisions responsible for whatever the outcome might be. Man, I'm not going. This is much better to talk about this kind of stuff in dialogue. I'm not doing a good job of this, but so essentially, it's not having the difference between having an internal locus of control and an external locus of control is not some superficial measure as to whether you came up with a solution yourself or if somebody else came up with a solution and you followed their trend. That doesn't matter if you came up with it first. It's that you decided to follow the trend or you decided to come up with it yourself, and that whatever the outcome is, you won't just say, oh, well, actually, I was misinformed and therefore I was duped or something like that. But actually, no, I hold myself accountable for whatever the outcome was. So that it was my fault that my trust wasn't well developed enough to realistically appreciate what was really going on. That you blame yourself, essentially, that the buck stops with you, and therefore you then hold the keys to the solution. Um, that's how the internal locus of control is preserved, essentially. And in the same sense that it has been said before that like in a democracy, people get the government that they deserve, and or every person gets the government. I think that there is some truth to that, which is also why perhaps I'm trying to seek independence for my province. In perhaps that will be a political strategy, um, because of the general sort of betrayal that I see of certain things, and I need to make sure that people are held to account for that betrayal. Otherwise, I will just deserve the government that lords over me. Um, but in the same way that in a democracy you can make that aphorism, that that I think that we can say definitely that is even more true of culture, that people live in the culture that they deserve. Because you are an equal participant in culture. And this idea that yeah, I mean, that I guess is a very hard thing for people to understand, especially with the corrupt sort of ethical generalizations within identity politics. It's very hard for people to imagine because you can always imagine a kind of envy that, oh, well, if I was a billionaire, then obviously my ideas and my cultural sentiments would be more powerful. I mean, I really don't actually believe that. Um, I mean, I guess there is a bit of a tactical sort of thing to do with ingenuity, and it's not enough just to have a pure cultural sentiment, but you also have to uh, involve yourself in being responsible for, let's say, cultural technology of how to interface with culture, and working out how to communicate effectively and convincingly and such. And I guess if you don't hold yourself accountable for developing those skills, then, you know, somehow they're just expected to be delivered to you. They're just expected to fall into your lap somehow. That they're supposed to come and find you or something like that. Sort of perversely incentivize a weird kind of indolence that strengthens your claim for social justice or your accusation of social injustice. So you get a hypothetical moral argument instead of actual uh, I guess I just keep on describing different themes on different aspects of the same theme, that when you self-delude yourself in a weird kind of hypothetical moral argument that's generalized and based on a kind of systemic condition, then you essentially deprive yourself of any opportunity of self-actualization, of any kind of metric of advancement. You've just that hypothetical model has literally somewhat castrated the whatever drive or energy that you might have had to look for an answer. And I would say that, I mean, there is a problem with asking that original question of the systemic oppression, because essentially that is kind of the question at the basis of that is, give me a morally unassailable, insulated position that cannot be challenged. Give me a hypothetical that, if people accept the premises of the hypothetical, is a compelling dilemma that then you can force onto people, and that is the wedge, that is the kind of the edge of the toxic infiltration of culture. Uh, it's the hypothetical construction of an insoluble that you can use to beat people over the head, and to force people to accept your reduction and your abstract categorization of life and reality, and therefore it dispenses with your capability, but also it dilutes your moral responsibility for actually navigating your life with any sense of robust responsibility, because whatever doesn't fall into the bag of your responsibility falls into the category of systemic oppression. And this is I mean, why this is what I mean by fudging, is that it's a sloppy, non-systematic, it's a sloppy narrative. It's much closer to a kind of mythological sort of relationship to an abyss. It's like harnessing the power of a void in order to conveniently occlude reality and to distort um, well, ethics in general, but also, the problem is that this mechanism essentially ends up broadly debasing a culture into just becoming a sort of a handmaiden, or a the culture ends up becoming a functionary of this mechanism. And yeah, I mean, I didn't go into it as much as I should have, but the superficial moral picture and the toxic conventions which are bought into in order to support this moral mechanism. I mean, I did explain it from some angles, but it is interesting because that particular, I mean, I would associate that with those conventions and those sorts of weird beliefs, which are sort of weird contorted facts and mixed in with ideology and sort of wishful thinking that is convenient to the ideological narrative, is very much what borderline personality disorder looks like, which is, generally speaking, falls on the female side of the population. I mean, there are male borderlines, but there are much more female borderlines. It's a much more significant portion of the female section of the population than it is of the male section, which is anyway. I mean, that I guess is just linked to the fact that feminism has brought us this kind of toxic narrative. Anyway, I've spoken about how, probably, I mean, in other recordings, how Hitler, I think, was imprinted on one of his female caregivers, which I think was his aunt or something, um, who raised him, who probably had borderline personality disorder, or one of his female caregivers did, and he essentially created his ideology in the image of borderline personality disorder in a way to kind of collectivize that relativistic sort of contortion of reality, so that everyone could equally access that kind of sort of projection on reality that conformed with the expectations, um, which are always framed as expectations of social conventions of, usually it's like around safety. Usually it's around, well, other people feel this safe, I should expect to feel this safe, and therefore you have now infringed on my feeling of safety because of this thing that I've projected onto you. So now you must take responsibility for that and ensure my safety, and therefore you've kind of inducted people into your subjective narrative, which is a very kind of autistic, solipsistic way of relating to reality, where it's just concerned with the self, with that subjective relativism. It's slightly broadened in identity politics, is that relativism is taken on behalf of a generalization, which is already a bit of an impossible feat, because it's weird how these people are somehow always speaking on behalf of an entire group. Somehow they consider themselves a representative of an entire generalization, which is a bit disgusting. Because you're no longer talking about ideas, you're saying that somehow ideas pertain to people in some kind of objective fashion, which is, again, that overt racism. Sadly, I don't do a lot of these topics justice because I don't plan out all of my uh, flow of argument and flow of presentation that well. But anyway, not changing my format too much, I need to take a third crack at this because I feel like I've done quite badly in substantiating the modus operandi of this infiltration of society. I mean, it is required to kind of have a more of a psychological review of sort of the cohort that does this on the left, because they're not all the same. There is a kind of you know it's part of the same sort of toxic complex, but you have different people performing different ideological functions. Um, and the overall outline and framework of the ideology is then also filled in by a secondary sort of sect, a secondary class of pseudo intellectuals that will sort of perform the right amount of fudging the conceptual interpretation of reality to fit into the ideological framework. And so, you get people that sort of directly propound, and there are actually not that many that actually directly um, encourage people to take on, let's say, the fully unadulterated or pure ideological framework. It's more necessary that people sort of just believe in the information that has already had this ideological framework sort of structured into it, that it's already been built into people's information sources and into essentially the pseudo intellectualism that they consume. Uh, and therefore it can kind of be concealed neatly into a narrative. So you get the people that actually know how the narrative is structured on a conceptual level, people like Vorsch, and then you have almost what I would consider to be the secondary class of people, which is people that deal with the actual tactical warfare, the actual sort of the small skirmishes, the small scale battles of actually creating essentially false polemics and things like that to make the applicability of the general ideological vision pertinent in a particular subject or a particular subset of society, or as in a subset of an issue in the culture, or an issue in society that then is seen as being properly facilitated or properly solved or properly attended to by the general ideology. And in some sense, identity politics can be seen as is perhaps a kind of a very close relation to radical leftist ideology. I mean, I think it really is window dressing the difference between the USSR and the kind of Leninist Stalinism and um, Nazism, because I mean, even it's interesting that I think the reason why Russians talk about the motherland and Nazis talk about the fatherland is essentially just because the land itself has a different role in the ideology. That in the Nazi ideology, the land is a metaphor of the ideology more greatly, because their ideology is much more mythologized. That it's essentially the birthplace of the identity. So it's the land is part of making history part of the present, whereas the motherland is because essentially it because the pure left wing radical ideology is that the ideology saves you, not your identity and the history of that identity. It's more of that adhere. So in some sense, I mean, is so I was trying to describe how essentially identity politics settles into two general ways of solving their problem. The one is segregation, and the other one is everyone believing in the same thing and attesting to believing in the same thing and having the same narrative on replay in their mind that you can just kind of get them to sing along with everyone else. But because that narrative is not a systemic, coherent, cogent way of grounding what words mean or whatever, because there are paradoxes and contradictions and it's all convoluted and messed up, you end up sort of having to fudge some kind of compromise between segregation and groupthink, or everyone attesting to the same thing, because otherwise it's very brittle to kind of keep that ethical mess sort of semi-functional at least. And in some sense, you can just almost see that on that same spectrum between everyone believing in the same thing and segregation, the Nazis as a tactical, in some sense you can just see it's a different emphasis in terms of tactics, like that the USSR believed in conformity, believed in everyone believing in the same narrative, and it was quite an abstract narrative. It wasn't part of a mythology in an identity. I mean, I guess you could say something about the Marxist hypothesis as being a bit of a kind of formulaic ideological recipe which could be mythologized, but it's that it never was rooted in the past. It was always rooted in the future as a vision that must be collectively held, whereas the Nazis sourced their identity in the history, that it was part of the land and that it was part of the inheritance or something like that. So in some sense, in both worldviews, the ideology functions as essentially the displacement of masculine energy. I would say that both ideologies are both representative of the devouring mother, archetypally speaking. And even within their systems, they both end up having both kinds of functionaries, where you have the let's say the pure ideologues, and then you get the tactical ideologues who get to be the field marshals and get to kind of aggregate and sort of be in the thick of some kind of ideological antagonism. And I think it's much easier to do this than people think it is. It's just that it has so much bad faith built into it. I mean, you can see this in many different intellectual realms, even that are completely apolitical. I mean, I've made videos about rationality rules and about how rationality rules is essentially what I would call a cerebral histrionic, which is what I would call of the destiny variety, that his kind of pseudo-intellectualism is of the destiny variety, and then you just have this kind of straw manning. It's this sort of you excuse your own dependence on ideology because there is no better alternative, and because you need to generate some kind of hypothetical solution to a problem, because essentially it's so evil. You've created such a moral hysteria and such a moral panic that it must be dealt with in some way, that you have to look like that you're doing something to ameliorate it. So it's always sort of at the coercion of this kind of moral expediency that is expected by some kind of moral picture, by some kind of convention. And there is a sort of there is, I guess, one point in terms of the kind of the meritocratic vision of a democratic society, is that you have some kind of you have to have access to opportunity. There actually has to be some kind of way in which there is a kind of something like equality of opportunity. That it might not be a strict equality of opportunity in each generation, but that it's something that can be progressively achieved in some sense. And And I mean, as I've stated before, I believe that there is something that culture has to have individual responsibility bootstrapped into it, and that um, in some sense, unless we're going to have the state displace the family unit, we're going to have to say that uh, you will be held um, to some degree vulnerable to the responsibility or lack thereof taken by your parents. That there is something like a kind of that the family unit is something that has to be furnished with some sense of autonomy and sanctum, and be sort of sanctioned and in some sense morally subordinated by um, sorry, what I meant to say is that the state should be morally subordinated to that family structure in some sense. Because if you don't do that, then you've kind of invented some kind of totalitarian, um, even be it in the name of some kind of liberal idealism or something like that. Um, and you've actually created a paradox that that sort of displaces the sanctity and the independence of the individual, which can at some point has to be protected via the entity of the family, um, and that the family cannot just be sacrificed to the state, essentially, um, or the sanctity of the family can't be sacrificed to the state. Anyway, this is not even a topic that I wanted to get into, but just going back to Pinochet, so to try to take a third crack at it and clean up some of the things that I said to try to clarify. So essentially, what I'm saying is that Pinochet did not have very clear structures within the institutions of democracy within Chile to use as barometers and to use as, let's say, clear triggers for defending the structure of democracy and the integrity of democracy. His society didn't have that sophistication. America also doesn't have that sophistication, which is why, in the same way that I will defend the McCarthy era, the Red Scare and all these sorts of things, um, what was it, the Tribunal for Anti-American something, all that sort of stuff. I agree that it's hideous, it's ugly, and it looks it and and that we should actually try to work out where the lines are. We should actually try, and I think that those lines actually have. I think that you have to make them around ethical lines, and in some sense, these institutions do exist within American culture, but they don't exist within the legal and political sort of structure. They have to be enforced by ad hoc committees that are generated in order to 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 try and sort these problems out. And that is, I don't think that that's desirable. It would be much desirable to have the lines clearly structured, and so you can say, look, you've crossed these lines now, Mr. Radical Leftist, and this is ethically not on, and you're infiltrating the society, and you're corrupting the functional basis of which libertarian values operate. And so those things exist within the South African legal framework because we've actually got non-racialism built into the constitution. So when people start using rhetoric and ideology, which very clearly destroys non-racialism and betrays it, we've got a line that has been crossed. Um, Now, obviously, South Africa is not the best example of this because the general political system is just so corrupt and has so much unaccountability. I mean, the ruling government is so dependent on this ideology of race baiting, essentially, and scapegoating its political failures, on using this convenient ideology, uh, that it just creates more and more dysfunction and mediocrity and unaccountability. It's just a kind of doom spiral. But anyway, so my point is that Pinochet, um, Pinochet didn't have the benefit of these sophisticated structures and lines that he could say, look, you've actually crossed the line. Um, and so I sympathize him, and obviously, I guess I can't avoid the fact that my historical reading can be interpreted by my critics as just being, well, this is special pleading on behalf of Pinochet. Um, and in some respect it is. But I do think it happens to be right, or at least roughly correct. And it's even proven by his actions that he did not hold on to power. He did relinquish it willingly. He wasn't, and you can almost tell that this was his plan all along. And it seems to me quite honourable. Um, you can judge him for it, or something like that, but obviously it would be better to not have to do anything like that, to have a system that's capable of defending itself against kind of ethical corruption and the slow boil of democracy from this, essentially this toxic infiltration. Now, yeah, so that's, I feel bad at not describing the toxic infiltration that well. But to me, it's more of a cultural thing than it is a political thing. It's and the part of culture is essentially the corruption of ethics. So it's a kind of it's a displacement of normative values and normative ethics with an ideological sort of recipe, um, that installs itself into the culture, and this creates a kind of a cultural economy for very toxic individuals to sort of operate with impunity, and to use this kind of political unaccountability, which is this kind, or this blind spot, which is almost directed by the false dichotomy. I mean, there are lots of ways of describing this false dichotomy, but it's because their ethical values are not normative, they are picture based, they are superficial values. That they are, it's like, it's just an outcome. It's like, this is what things need to add up to. So the means will just the ends will justify the means, because we must arrive at that, and we must expediently race towards achieving that outcome. And therefore it doesn't matter what we do in the meantime, and therefore we're unaccountable for how we arrive at there. As long as we tell everyone that that's where we want to end up, then we have carte blanche. And that's the kind of the recipe that is used, and all you have to do is basically keep that moral hysteria, keep that moral panic in focus, and to sort of protect it from any other alternative interpretation of reality or ethics. And so how you freeze that is basically with a kind of what I would call cultural totalitarianism, and this is the infiltration that grows. Um, and it's very crafty. It has very many different sort of tools at its exposure, at its disposal, because it can, it's ironic that, if you say that, it's sort of exploiting people as sheep, um, because, and essentially what it is claiming is that people are already being exploited, and they are providing the only way to fight against that kind of collective exploitation, against a kind of collective systemic evil that has representation, that can be targeted and scapegoated. Um, so it's just this kind of finger, or the flaming eye of Sauron, or something like that. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that metaphor too much, but so it is certainly convoluted. It is certainly messy. And I think, this is almost, I mean, I think this is almost like the end of history, or I mean, you can peek over the wall at the end of history, that it's possible to arrive there. And the last hurdle are these so-called radical left-wing Marxists and identitarians. Is basically the last hurdle is totalitarian culture. If we can just navigate our way to suppressing totalitarian culture and its promoters and its adherents, if we can ethically surmount them and prevail and wrestle culture away from them, then we can, I think, have a stable basis for building a decent society. By, by the way, when I say end of history, I don't mean the end of perhaps even economic history or something like that, but or in some sense, in some pseudo sense, political history. But I mean the end of um, I mean the creation of a consensus around politics that can be a stable platform for, I I think, what I've even called as, that could be used to do many things. That could be used for a non-revolutionary Marxist progression, even. Um, or some, sort of interesting things within the realm of normal politics. Um, some interesting developments, but the bones of the default system that will be a kind of moral consensus that will essentially, I mean, I see it almost in Marxist terms in some sense, because that cultural consensus and moral consensus is important to stop history from repeating itself. Essentially, I do see that. I mean, because I don't think that identity politics infused radical leftism will do anything other than repeat history, rather. And I'd rather not go through that kind of turmoil, which will, if anything, more probably lead to a stable fascistic enterprise, if anything, which will invariably lead to other kinds of degeneration, but perhaps a stable political structure, which will be a hideous one, which will basically strip humanity of any kind of enlightenment or any kind. It'll grow more stupid, more pathetic, more insipid. Um, in much the same way as the kind of the hollow structure that the USSR promulgated, the same kind of depravity and self-denigration, and sort of, although I would think that, I mean, yeah, anyway, I do think it'll likely be more fascistic than like the USSR, but the USSR sort of had a weird schism with it. It had a weird cognitive dissonance within its own operation that is very strange. There was less cognitive dissonance in the fascistic manifestation, but it was more stupid. It was more magical and mythological, to sort of to make up for that cognitive dissonance in some sense. But in some way, it was more cogent because of its mythology, whereas the USSR was more sort of weirdly uh, intellectually self-contradictory on many sort of sophisticated levels. Um, that you just kind of had to justify as that, well, there's no other way to go about it. So it was sort of the same kind of intellectual tension manifested and expressed, in different forms to some degree, but also the I think the identity politics is going to switch over into fascism more. There's going to be a schism in identity politics. I mean, there are lots of schisms, but a new pronounced schism will start to emerge in identity politics, and it will be around what I've already described as the kind of the two general solutions that identity politics invariably leads towards, which is on the one hand segregation, and on the other hand conformist narrative, conformist ideology. And in some sense, the more you go into the conformist ideology, the more you try to develop that semantic, convoluted moral mess, the more you try to make that fit, you start to realize just how fudged it is, how sloppy the thinking is, how insane it is, how ludicrous it is. And to avoid its own absurdity, it has to start depending more and more on segregation. And this has already started happening. This already happens within identity politics, that they have to separate seminar rooms, that they have to try to create safe spaces to avoid running into their own ethical dilemmas and their own, sort of disgusting projections that they generalize and throw onto people and project onto everything and everyone, in making people representatives of a kind of systemic, sort of holocaust or something like that. I mean, they don't use that word, but that's the kind of moral panic, that's the kind of hysteria that the whole ideology is hedged on, and leverages. So that schism will eventually start to become more, it'll start to become less nebulous, and it'll start to become more pronounced. And then you'll start to see people gravitate towards stop being proto-fascist and to start being full-blown fascist. And maybe they'll even do it in the same way that in Mein Kampf it's described, that everyone will have their own ethno-states, and that, we just need to separate for our own good so that we can all achieve our own purity, because essentially we can't just have this weird kind of codependency when we're all exploiting each other because of our different cultural innatenesses, or whatever it is, or our different historic. I mean, you see, identity politics still tries to say that this is all culturally, this is essentially a cultural problem, and it will be fixed by a cultural reset. But essentially, the proof of any kind of reset point is a superficial picture that requires a level of superficial evaluation of things, that you end up having to believe in in this weird kind of symbolism, in this weird kind of, and already it can never achieve that, because even if it gets some kind of statistical parity, you'll still have the individual that says, no, well, I've actually got a more intersectional systemic oppression against me, because when I walk down the street, I don't get the same amount of smiles as somebody else gets, or I don't, and there's nothing to stop it. There's nothing that stops that happening, because it's all fudged. It's fudged on every level. It doesn't matter. That might seem like an extremely absurd example, but it already is that level of craziness, because it doesn't see the difference between someone who has one of these identity things but actually doesn't have any oppression, but in their mind they still have oppression, because it's some kind of collective lived experience, because essentially they believe in that racial imagination. They have already projected it into being. They have already expected it. And they already have changed their ethical standards into that. And I mean, this happened even sort of early on, I think. That there was that there's a weird kind of superficial conservatism that is woven into wokeness, because eventually it has to rely on just kind of brute, blunt, crude tokens and and tokenism and kind of stereotypes. It has to, at some point, just has to get a shorthand so that it can work out which part of the narrative they're supposed to be reciting in reaction. to be on the right side of history, or to be part of their um, and so, that's why I call it proto-fascist, is because essentially what they're reacting against is the same interpretive mindset and worldview that the fascists have. They conceptualize society the same. They categorize uh, reality in the same way. And once you've acclimatized people to that level of simplicity and that level of moral certitude that they can just sort of channel, it's like it's too empowering in the hypothetical sense, because they can just be entitled to something and they can choose who they want to extract it from. It's sort of like, they can just project whatever subjective narrative fits their sense of they can work it backwards. You can sort of want to have an expectation and then work out the kind of accusation that you would have to the kind of blanket complaint that you would have to levy against the system in order to expect that someone should promise it to you, based on basically a kind of proto-Führer principle. The savior of the system should come and save your identity. So you can play it both ways. You can sort of and this is, I mean, this means that you don't even have to live your life. You don't have to navigate your life. You don't have to have trust in anything or curate trust in anything. You can just have this ideological trust instead in the narrative. So you can just trust in the stereotype. You can trust in the identity. You end up only trusting the identity, which is supposed to be your only source of self-esteem. And so you can never believe in yourself, or what believe in yourself actually means is it means believe in your identity, which then you have to fight on behalf of, um, as a way to believe in yourself. It's this it's the sort of the redefinition of life into this corrupt moral system. Uh, so I mean, yeah, I mean, it should be said as well. Just the kind of, I think already, even if you try to deal with this ideology now, the amount of racism that has been created, the amount of new racism, I mean, you've essentially corrupted a whole generation into woke racism, essentially. And even if you cure them of their wokeness, you'll still have to cure them of their racism, um, which is very problematic. I don't know how that's going to, to explain to people normative ethics and non-racialism, which they don't understand normative ethics. They only understand superficial ethics, superficial morality. They understand achieving a moral picture. That's all they get. And then they're allowed to do whatever they want as long as they say that they're aiming at the right moral picture. That's that kind of dark sophistry which has now been mixed into the culture and normalized. Um, yeah, I didn't do a very good job of deconstructing essentially the. I mean, I've talked about it. I've repeatedly talked about it, but I haven't sort of given the whole mechanics of that. But how you have. But it is in my other recordings. I talk about. And I talk about how borderline personality disorder is the core of this identity politics fascism, essentially, or is the rubric, or is the formula for it. And specifically, how borderlines decompartmentalize their hosts, how they find, usually it's a woman who will find a man in their life, and then they will kind of, the man will already have some kind of, perhaps some tendency towards some kind of narcissistic trait, and then the borderline will will give that narcissist, or will try to feed that potential narcissistic supply, and then will withhold the narcissistic supply after conditioning that man to want the narcissistic supply, and then they will withhold the narcissistic supply in order to try to make them into a very specific kind of hollow narcissist. It's interesting because they don't actually want a real narcissist. They want to make a narcissist. They want to condition a very particular species of narcissism. And I don't even call it narcissism myself. I call it cerebral histrionic. That they actually want to create a form of a histrionic personality disorder, which, and histrionics generally have incredibly large components of narcissism within their makeup. But anyway, this is all jargon, but this is what I go into in some of my other recordings. But anyway, I'm just going to leave this here. But and so in some sense, you know, this I think can be prevented with culture. If you have an enlightened enough culture that has enough sort of alarm bells built into it, that it will not allow people to sort of to weave these spells on over, you know, and corrupt subcultures. um I kind of touched a little bit on how I think that happened in terms of the black subculture, how it was adopted into this toxic mode, uh, which wasn't always the case, but was the case since essentially the expansion of the welfare state. Uh, and I believe Candace Owens, you know, sort of thinking about this is very accurate. You know, that, you know, it's like a plant, it's like a slave plantation to a large extent. That's how the Democrats rely and treat this toxic subculture, which is only prone to their kind of rhetoric and their kind of worldview and narrative, because these people are somewhat kept dependent, but ideologically dependent on this external locus of control, and believing that they're suppressed by systemic oppression. Well, ironically, the kind of policy that the Democrats sort of employ somewhat promulgate that way of relating to your environment, or make it, they perversely incentivize it. Thomas Sowell said this thing that Democrats always want to help poor people, but Republicans want to help poor people by preventing them from being poor, by helping them not be poor in some sense. And Democrats will only help you while you are poor. And so there's this, if you can imagine that this is a political market, uh, the Democratic formula only works if there is a majority of poor people that will buy their solution in some sense. That will be vulnerable or prone to their moral formula. Anyway, I guess I'm not going to continue, but maybe that clarifies some of the points a bit. Okay, this is yet a further addendum. I mean, I'm a bit embarrassed by the fact that I haven't been able to sort of communicate this point clearly. So, what I'm really trying to describe is how there becomes a kind of it, in how the culture becomes intoxicated or toxified, that because you've kind of got this moral mechanism which is like fundamentally unsound, because you've kind of got the ends justify the means, which is propelling a moral panic. And it is slightly more complicated than that, because it's not just the moral panic is not everything. It's part of why the culture gets more and more toxic, is because in the ends justify the means. The end is a negative moral standard in that it's describing the removal of a condition. In what is to be arrived at is essentially a moral picture. It's no longer, the moral picture sort of displaces normative values and a normative standard of ethics. So instead of so somehow this moral picture displaces normative values. That the moral panic is that we must arrive at that outcome, at what that outcome would look like as symbolized by a moral picture. And so the means justify the ends in the moral picture displaces principles, essentially, because the outcome of that moral picture is the principle embodied. So there's that equivocation that is woven into what becomes essentially a cultural convention. Now, under the auspices of that toxic convention, you end up creating a secondary sort of cultural economy for rational association to be hypothetically um, uh, 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 toyed with or explored, hypothetically explored. That essentially you've got, because you see, if the moral picture is made up of a negative condition, that it's that, oh well, something must be removed. There's a condition that the moral picture is showing the removal of a condition. So then how many ways can you construct a negative condition? So like, how do you arrive at the absence of something? You can effectively, you can imagine an infinite variety of candidate sequences of rational association that go into removing a condition. And so this is where the whole thing falls down, and why you get such convoluted moral depravity and degeneration when you've got these kinds of moral pictures. Because I'm not going through this very cogently, but anyway, I'll just continue. And so essentially, how this also manifests in terms of, that there are many different ways of removing this condition, is that it empowers, let's say, subjective interpretation, because you can create your own candidate narrative as to a certain set of things that must be followed, a certain formula, a certain recipe to arrive at the moral picture that removes that condition. Because essentially all you have to do is associate the negative condition with something that you expect to be controlled for. Yeah, and there is also a tangential point here which is quite important, which is this is why the left is so vulnerable to this kind of moral recipe, is because the idea that you can just kind of impose rules that control and remove a negative condition, and that's essentially the most efficient way to control for something, instead of doing it consensually, doing it within culture, not essentially an imposed culture or a coerced culture. Um, that is in a heavy-handed way, not trying to convince people of anything, but just trying to impose certain strictures that lead to the moral picture outcome. And so it's a kind of, it's almost like an unconscious formula of an automated moral efficiency or something like that. Uh, which I think in some sense the reason why it's toxic is because it completely and almost directly undoes, let's say, the Kantian moral imperative, or the categorical imperative of um, of treating people as an ends in themselves, which is something that Kant himself messes up quite badly when he tries to institutionalize his categorical imperative and how he endorses institutions. You get these very strange sorts of paradoxes. Anyway, moving back from that, what you end up getting is sort of in league of this theme of the moral panic to just arrive at some end. What that psychologically ends up equating to is individuals who are, when I said empowered, I should have said like hypothetically empowered, because their imaginations get empowered because they can just come up with rational associations and generate stricture from those rational associations that if everyone just follows those prescriptions, then we get all the nice things somehow. And then when it doesn't turn out to be that way, well, then there's just more radical stricture which is needed to kind of to tie up all the loose ends, and it never ends in that sort of way, because there is a hidden theory at the basis of this. You get a kind of unchecked assumption that is hidden within the moral panic, which is that at the removal of some subset of conditions, you arrive at the moral picture. I would say that this is downstream from the fact that you've destroyed normative ethics, you've destroyed normative values, you've displaced them with a superficial value system, which cannot avoid its own sort of corruption, the influence of that corruption, almost on a philosophical level. You've tried to create an idolatry of an is that supplements for an ought. Anyway, I still haven't gotten to the point that I want to get to, which is that imagination that people have of getting from the negative stricture to the moral picture is itself always an inexact, let's say, imaginary science. It's always a hypothetical, it's a weird kind of hypothetical claim. And the only way to not call it hypothetical is if you completely foul up essentially the relativism paradox, essentially, that how do you make an objective claim about reality from a subjective point of view? You can't arrive at the one from the other. But this sort of way of operating culture directly infringes that paradox. It just completely overlooks it. And because you have to create a kind of normalization of that paradox, what that ends up doing is it becomes dark. It becomes a kind of sinister form of sophistry. It really does. And essentially what is being done by the culture, or a culture that permits this, or facilitates it, is you are allowing people to sadistically employ their imagination into coming up with recipes of rational associations as to how they can describe or subjectively interpret people's, whatever it may be, actions or beingness or identity or whatever, as being connotative of the removal of a condition which is required to arrive at some ideal moral outcome. And so once a culture has got that sort of woven into it, you have just disguised moral superiority, or you've when I say you've disguised it, what I mean is you've just surrendered the notion of moral superiority and conflated it with essentially sadistically edged gainsaying. Because now all you have to do is, on the right interpretation of data, on the right interpretation of certain key facts, you can entrench a kind of a narrative as to how your prescriptions and your subjective interpretation is going to lead to the removal of some condition which is going to arrive at the outcome of some lofty moral picture. And so under the auspices of that anti-normative value system, you've just got, I mean, you've just got self-degradation and ethical depravity proliferated. I mean, it's like a tsunami, and this is why you get, these feminists who are, so proud about having abortions, because because if you can exhibit that kind of sadistically edged, like, oh well, this is going to psychologically shock people, and it's good to in a sadistically edged way, force people to put up with your prescriptions that are relativistically interpreted, then you are acclimatizing them to the greater new moral paradigm. So you're ushering people into this new ethical domain, as it were, which is where one person's imagination, their relative imagination about rational associations, are all justified in arriving at that picture. Now, these pictures themselves, I would generally call them all proto-fascist, because this is what fascists do. This is why fascists live in a mythology around their identity. This is why they must believe in some kind of blood and soil, or some kind of fatherland, or something like that. And the same thing does also exist in, I would say, the USSR and the Leninist kind of worldview, where essentially, I mean, it is slightly more abstract than the overt identity politics of fascism, because in the USSR it was essentially the it had to be enacted constantly by the leadership, kept the ideology alive. It was sort of Stalin clapping for his own speeches, the kind of the sanctity of the dictatorship of the proletarian had, so, there was a lot of hypocrisy within the USSR system, but people always played the performative role required to so it, in some sense, the framing of the culture was, had more intellectual cognitive dissonance within it, whereas in fascism it kind of it more overtly becomes, and I mean, again, I've already described why there is this distinction between fascism and state capitalism, or socialism, or whatever, or let me just call it Leninism, um, is simply because the window dressing in fascism is that the moral ideology, um, makes a claim that you are inheriting something that was lost to your identity. That your identity, that as you lean into identity politics, you are excavating the history of your identity, is being returned to. The mythology is being excavated, whereas in the USSR, it's all theoretical. It's like Marx was the prophet, and we are fulfilling the prophecy, and it's not even a prophecy. It's something that we have to make true. So it's all in the future. So the kind of the identity that we want to arrive at is in the future, whereas in fascism, the identity that they want to reclaim is being imported from what was lost in history, and what is being recovered. And that just means that the one has a more obvious way to diffuse the kind of the cognitive dissonance which is in both ideologies, by disguising it in a kind of convoluted narrative, and a convoluted narrative around a mythological history. Whereas, and this is why I always say that identity politics is proto-fascism, and it will precipitate towards overt fascism. It won't, it because it's much easier to disguise the cognitive dissonance in essentially in the gain saying that this is how it always was and this is how we will make it again, rather than saying, well, we're all just doing this because this is the way to maximize it in some sense. So I mean, it's interesting because, like, in pure intellectual terms, you could call Leninism to be more pure, in the sense that it's more overtly intellectual. But I mean, I would say that it's just as into they're both intellectually deficient, but in some sense the Leninism gets closer to the sun, as it were, as it's blinding itself. So it sort of it has to sort of maim its own intelligence in order to more concretely, in order to believe in the formula, which in some sense, I mean, you know, it's interesting because, you know, the kind of performative roles that people were playing in the USSR, you know, you could tell that they essentially didn't believe in it, you know, that they were all jaded cynics, but somehow the the conformity, you know, of the groupthink in terms of the public face, you know, it's weird how essentially the notion of authority itself, or of governance, or of coherent, you know, sort of, you know, how that kind of becomes an alien force that is relegated to this kind of imaginary sort of formulaic rubric of how life has to be lived according to some idealism that is essentially a kind of becomes a kind of anti-realist domain, where it's like, as long as that superficial the superficial formula and the superficial moral picture is being fulfilled, it doesn't matter what actually happens on the ground, as long as what's written in the history book is adjusted, you know, and history is corrected for by, you know, cutting people out of the picture or whatever. Um, this addendum is already getting a bit too esoteric, but let me just finish this point about, I guess, the USSR. I mean, I can imagine some people would think it's unfair to merge Stalin's legacy with Lenin's legacy, but let me make the case on a kind of intellectual level, or on the ethical level that I'm trying to sort of describe about the culture, is that, you know, I guess if you want to play devil's advocate and say, well, actually, Lenin knew that what he was doing was not proper socialism, it was state capitalism. He knew that his dictatorship of the proletarian was a complete historical subversion from even the, you know, the orthodox Marxist hypothesis, and that he was acting as a kind of as a doctor upon history. Um, and he was trying to doctor even the Marxist hypothesis himself, and that therefore, at least in some circle within the USSR, he would have preserved to a much greater degree a calibration of how they were missing the mark, relative to the general outline that they were taking from the original Marxist hypothesis of the maturing of capitalism, and needing to essentially end this, what would otherwise be a non-stop cycle of dialectical materialism or something like that. But that much, even if that is intellectually conceded on some level within the leadership, it doesn't change essentially how you've created culture as a subset of playing to these idealistic contentions, which still follow my format as I've described it, as having a moral picture for an outcome and having that moral picture be constituted out of negative moral standards of the removing of certain conditions, of needing certain conditions to be absent. And therefore, it opens up the realm to this imaginative, rational association game that you can play as to all the things that you need to control and regulate and quash preemptively, or to vilify, or to finger and point at. Um, so it requires this kind of this intelligentsia sort of finger pointing in order to keep the revolution safe, and that is even in Lenin's own rationale, that essentially that they are performing a holding action, in the kind of in the orthodox Marxist hypothesis. They are performing a holding action. Now, I think even if Lenin didn't have his right-wing adaptation to Marxism, and I actually, I chide myself for even, saying things like that, the right-wing adaptation. I guess the thing is that the moral picture stuff does have some historical association even with superficial conservatism, is what I will call it. And so I'm very opposed to social conservatism being enforced from state apparatus. I think that is what has even created the room for our culture to be vulnerable to this kind of left-wing scourge, because and this left-wing radicalization, because culture was not already at a developed point without essentially the coercion of state guardrails, as it were, enforcing a kind of a moral picture which essentially stopped the development of culture. Like, okay, I know that what I'm saying is very sort of experimental in some sense, because I'm in some sense hypothesizing that people don't need to be led in terms of their morality from anything other than consensual. And again, this is why I think religion has been dampened by essentially social conservatism being invoked or being imposed in a kind of de facto way by baking it into legal stricture, in terms of how women were suppressed or repressed from not being able to be financially independent, and being able to administer their own estate, for instance, their own. Um, I mean, sorry, this is getting so esoteric, but so I mean, anyway. So I do blame a lot of the toxin that we're in now as sort of part of the hangover of these moral pictures, as it were, which have been used on the left and on the right, but sort of in the final analysis, in some sense, I guess, in terms of mainstream right wing sort of thinking or conservative politics, um, it's used a little bit. I mean, which is why I'm slightly sympathetic to them, because, and why I say that all my proposals are somewhat experimental, because who knows if society is capable of coming to that internal um, sort of equilibrium. I mean, it is slightly, it hasn't happened before. We haven't yet produced an enlightened culture um, that is sort of consensually, by culture itself being made up of autonomous individuals, negotiated into a stable form that's capable of having sort of functioning organic institutions, um, that doesn't just precipitate into some kind of fascism or something like that. And so, I do think that the the problem that identity politics poses to culture, which does seem to rear up when when let's say conventional norms are broken, and then incredibly toxic ones threaten to take their place, that the kind of the third way in this is to have an enlightened culture and, let's say, liberal, the classical libertarian value um, of responsibility and individual accountability and individual autonomy, which is, encroached on both on the left and on of the right. So I mean, I'm just going to say that don't equate what I'm saying as saying that, like, well, the real fault of this is somehow the traditional conservative forces in society. I mean, like, those were different stages of history, those were different times, and maybe it was sort of the best compromise. And obviously, British political liberalism managed to come out of those times. So anyway, man, there's so many tangents here, and it's impossible to sort of to give all of them the right amount of focus. But anyway, this is not really important. This is just a kind of a background to the contemporary crisis and culture, and it doesn't change what I think the solution is that um, we freely choose, let's just say, libertarian values that underpin democracy, because then we will actually have a radically functioning democracy. We will actually have a democracy that doesn't just lean into the hypothetically easy solutions that are built on a kind of cultural toxicity that ends up repeating culture, that ends up. So I mean, in some sense, I don't see it. I mean, in the final analysis, I guess perhaps I can't really keep on describing myself as a Marxist. That I would have to be some kind of cultural Hegelian or something like that, but with in some kind of post-Marxist, sort of analysis. But I'm sort of, but I still take, I still take lessons from the orthodox Marxist hypothesis. I just don't think that revolution has anything to do with transcending capitalism, essentially. Um, and I also think that the kind of the false dilemma which is described, especially by Lenin in some sense, for him to do his preemptive holding action upon the historical process, um, is to disengage from is to try to have a kind of a it's a very cynical, it's a very jaded um, way of sort of leaning into your paranoia, so that you are allowed to play this game of rational association, so that you're allowed to lean into this kind of sadistically edged um, relativism paradox, essentially. And essentially, you get away with that by just merely collectivizing it as a kind of as a political project. That if you have enough people that agree that that, I mean, in some sense, it's, the vanguard in Leninism. I don't see that as that distinct from the Führer principle. I mean, they seem utterly um, ideologically equivalent. Um, Lenin's vanguard and the Führer principle, which is at the core of having a in some sense, again, it's more neatly fixed. This intellectual sort of schism waiting to happen is more neatly dealt with by the fascists, sort of compromise, you could call it, because in the Führer principle, you are more directly dealing with the fact that you know that you have a relativism paradox. Therefore, you have to create a kind of a collectivist epistemological authority That in the same way that these disgusting people in philosophy departments talk about um, epistemic injustice as a kind of as an outgrowth of their sort of their weirdly convoluted identity politics moralizing. I mean, there is such a thing as epistemic authority. Sorry, as epistemic injustice, but it's impossible to quantify. Obviously, because if you could quantify it, if you could name it, then it wouldn't have been lost. It wouldn't. The truth would not have been damaged. That the truth is something that if it is damaged, there is nothing that can be done. Uh, that's how high and mighty and the concept of the truth is. The idea that you could derive some kind of sociological compensation of some kind of power grab that you're going to facilitate because you're going to sort of rehabilitate damage done to the truth by playing some kind of power struggle across some kind of racialist essentialism between differing groups that have some kind of memory of the truth that was lost to them. It's so disgustingly sort of naively racist. It's so fudged. It's so but I mean, now this is what philosophy has is doing now in the West to a large degree, as academia has been captured, is that it's there essentially to try to justify and vindicate the sentiments and the convoluted moralizing within identity politics. It's there essentially to very slowly try to rebuild what the Nazis had essentially, which was the Führer principle. They're trying to find some kind of deductive formula for arriving at how they can know that someone is representing their identity or something like that, which is effectively the Führer principle, so that they can take a kind of collective, uh, so that they can have a kind of a force of prescribing what the solution is for their group, so that they can be nicely catered to, and so that so that it can be imagined that you're going to reach some kind of reset point with the use of these disgusting negative standards of removing conditions that will precipitate the lofty moral picture, so that they will then be able to sort of retroactively confirm that the ends did justify the means. And this is why I call it, fundamentally tautological. It's a tautological sort of moral, but also epistemic narrative, um, where the moral conclusions are used as the epistemic premises in this tautological narrative. I mean, it's just uh, it's a mind virus. But as I say, it's too much for radical leftists to give up, because it gives them the excuse to control society. It gives them the moral sort of. Uh, it has the same moral. Um, anyway, okay, I've made all my points, I guess. What I was just trying to, before I went on that down that rabbit hole, that the the whole point about me talking about Leninism is just how it was already a a spoiled intellectual project. It was already a morally deficient. It already had that moral degeneracy sort of baked into it, and so that is why I understand that when I was I mean, I just was playing devil's advocate against myself, and I realized that when I made the Stalin metaphor about cutting out the pictures, that people would say, this is just pie in the sky, sort of straw manning or something like that. But anyway, Man, this is completely sort of different, but I mean, I've been making these recordings trying to criticize Graham Oppy, and I mean, I'm going to stop doing that, I guess. I've got one other recording that I made of it, but I guess I have to add one addendum onto that, because I think it's much the same formula as this. I mean, I've already kind of described it in intellectual, but it's very interesting how academia itself seems to be very prone to this kind of formula of intellectualism, that it's not so much, you're not so much making a positive case of positive substantiations as to why this is the way to do something. It's this kind of all or nothing secure, this kind of thing. Well, if you can just accept these presumptions, if you can just accept this model, this idealism, if you can just if we can just keep on, if we can just keep everything within the ambit of this orthodoxy, within the ambit of this rubric, and impose this structure and force everyone to sort of funnel into these kinds of, you know, it doesn't keep its eyes open to the fact that, everything is based on some kind of um, sort of interpretive slant in some sense. Uh, and it doesn't keep track of its own commitments, as it were. Um, I mean, Graham Oppy is perhaps slightly better at this because, in some sense, he is making a very, what's the word? Uh, I mean, technically, if you boil down what he's actually saying, he's making a very humble, compact sort of claim, um, or a very minimalistic sort of claim, which is just that uh, this might as well be as good as theism. Like what I'm proposing might as well be seen as just as good as theism within looking at it from this perspective, and it's a very kind of inductive kind of rational appeal in some sense, but it's not. Um, I shouldn't have said rational. I should have said logical. I don't think it is actually rational, because it is fundamentally inductive. Um, and so it's based on this kind of, it's hedged on saying, well, what better could we do? And I do think that you could do a lot better, which is why, I mean, my biggest argument to it is, well, look at my worldview. I think it's much more deductive, it's much more certain, it's much more positively substantiated than your basically sort of straw manning of theism to say, well, what better can we do after straw manning everything else? But in some sense, if his categorization of his straw man, in some sense, I mean, it does. I don't think it does include me. I don't know if he would call what I describe as a form of theism. Um, I mean, I would, on some technical level, perhaps, he would say, well, that's a kind of transcendental um, phenomenology, or something like that. So I don't know if he could, if it definitionally falls into his category of theism or something like that. So, which again, I mean, like, then how useful is this whole thing, where essentially it's only good against saying that it's better than a particular category of straw man or something like that. And then sort of the hidden premise of this is that it's a false dichotomy. Well, you either have to go with something like his worldview, or you have to go with an inferior worldview, and that those are the only two choices, that there isn't a third way. And it's kind of implicitly closing the eye, it's closing one's eyes and blinding oneself to the fact, well, is there actually any other, is this dilemma really real, or unavoidable? I mean, you can also see this kind of false dilemma stuff used in the identity politics as well. Uh, I didn't point it out when I was already getting into enough sort of complexity to throw in that tangent, essentially. But I do think that there is something a bit perverse about the scientific method, which has a lot of the characteristics of the things that I spoke about in terms of the belief. I mean, not the use of the scientific method, but the belief in the scientific method is very philosophically and morally deficient. I mean, it's not even a cogent philosophical point of view, which is also why Graham Oppy's naturalism is a bit cringeworthy. I mean, it sort of plugs into this very naive, widespread sentiment that somehow philosophy is this grand intellectual enterprise, when it is, that science is some grand intellectual philosophical enterprise. Um, I don't know if I misspoke that, but it certainly is not. In fact, it's so philosophically misunderstood that it is essentially quite stale. I mean, science has really not progressed in about, I think about now, I guess we could say about 80 years. I mean, we've made experimental excursions into further confirmation of things, but essentially theoretically on the deepest level, I would say we have really not done anything. I mean, you can the discovery of the Higgs boson and things like that, but I mean, we have um, anyway. I mean, the you know the I'm personally looking for the kind of advancement that Penrose kind of outlines, which says we do need a new kind of physics. Um, anyway, this is getting okay. This is way too esoteric and off the point. But at some point, I think I might go and address some of these more general things. But this is definitely not the recording to do them in. Yeah, let me just get right back into that and round out that point, because I realize it seems like it's going off the rails, me complaining about academia and scientism and things like that. But just to kind of round out this point, is that there seems to me, almost on a quite deep and fundamental, almost psychological level, but that creeps into intellectualism, and this is not often directly diagnosed within, let's say, the sicknesses and pathologies of intellectualism, is that there's this kind of existential self-pity that, well, we need to rely in this external locus of control, we need to rely on this method, because if we don't control, if we don't have this kind of model that allows us to control for disguising to us all the inconvenient, sort of perspectives that don't fall into our wheelhouse of this formulaic reduction of reality, then we are banished to the wasteland. We are lost, and we have no father. We have no, we have no external locus of control to treat as a kind of paternal image to put ourselves in the image thereof. So we need some kind of cult about logic being this underlying matrix of reality, and that although we don't understand the matrix, if we say that we found some puzzle pieces, and that from those puzzle pieces, that's enough to say, well, these are puzzle pieces of the great unimatrix, of the great underlying fabric and medium that everything exists within. And although we don't get these puzzle pieces to fit together quite perfectly, as long as we can kind of abstractly line up the lines of the matrix which they both seem to represent, they both have these, let's say, this grid that can be imagined, that they are strewn within. And the grid in this metaphor is is this idea that, well, there's this background logic that is immutable and that is pervasive. It just requires us to treat all problems in a particular sort of in a likewise reductive, perspective, which has all these fudge things built into it, that destroys the relativism paradox, or that allows us to not question our presumptions and our commitments that allow us to even get into that realm. But it's sort of there's this existential angst that says, well, if we don't have this method of doing it, then we truly have nothing. So it's this or nothing, and don't banish us to the abyss of not, sort of falling under the star of some, external authority. And it really, I mean, although I criticize a lot of what I would call false religion for that same kind of petulant, angsty, sort of, just give me a pagan sky father and I'll call it monotheism, just any kind, that spiritualism is just baked into a narrative that you have to kind of adopt wholesale, and that has to be seen as above you, and you are its child or something like that. I find it quite ironic that so many of scientism falls into exactly the same thing that I criticize as false religion, because it has no intimate connection to, let's say, the philosophical spiritual condition. It's completely devoid of any kind of engagement in uncovering some kind of phenomenological basis for its own belief or something like that. It would rather just have it cast within a general methodological spell in some sense, and everyone believes in the same kind of magic. That in some sense, how it excuses itself is, well, how else would I get agreement with other people except by the understanding that everyone believes in the same form of magic? And so it's this uh, I do see that as sadly the kind of almost the existential corruption. I mean, I treat these issues much more delicately when I'm actually talking about my worldview, and when I'm talking about pure philosophical themes that deal with this. I've got recordings on Vasti Root's Living with Nihilism, and the epistemic responsibilism of Catherine Elgin. And also some of my commentary on what I would consider to be unfortunate remarks by Catherine Elgin. But although I generally endorse her philosophy, but some of her, let's say, personal opinions, which I believe that she uh, incorrectly associates with some of her philosophical structures, I try to delineate and draw pointed distinctions between. But anyway, but yeah, I do think that these sorts of issues are come to the fore within the context of epistemic responsibilism, and also within the context of with some particular regard with some of Vasti Root's conceptual structure in her chapter of Living with Nihilism. Anyway. Just not to mislead anyone superficially, that her chapter Living with Nihilism is about nihilism, but it's about Nietzschean nihilism, and it's basically what I would consider to be the because you see, the problem with Nietzsche is that he wasn't a conventional philosopher, because he didn't write philosophy. He only wrote his novels, and so you have to kind of extract his philosophical position, or some kind of cogent, synthesized philosophical position, from his writings, which are not explicitly framed positively. They are demonstrated, or he is trying to exemplify themes which you could say leads to the synthesis of some kind of cogent philosophical position or stance on things, but he doesn't explicitly do that work. And I would say that Vostiroot is someone who has actually put the nail, hit the nail on the head. She has um, actually broken the code of Nietzschean nihilism, and she has worked out how it works. So yeah, so her thing, living with nihilism, is basically in another way you could read it as how to transcend nihilism, or how nihilism is the foundation of a very meaningful worldview, which is probably paradoxical, but if you read the chapter, you'll understand. Anyway,